By the end of this movie, you will be convinced that this man is the greatest boxer in the history of humanity.
In the history of boxing, there are champions who by coincidence have been forgotten. We are not talking about those who grabbed the title thanks to very competent work of promoters and great luck and then parted with the belt during the first defense.
In the history of boxing, there's a tale to be told of champions who shone bright but whose stories grow cold. Not the ones with mere luck, not just title holders in fame, but true diamonds in the ring, forever known by name.
We are talking about diamonds of the rarest brilliance. The one we want to talk about has twice won the Boxer of the Year award.
Come by coincidence, but never by his might. He stepped into the ring and turned the dark to light. Not just a flash in history, but brilliance rare and pure. A heavyweight destroyer, his legacy will endure.
He has a record of 20 wins over boxers who are inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame. You heard me right. 20 victories over recognized legends whose name is immortalized there, where every boxer dreams to get to. Sugar Ray Robinson, who is considered the greatest boxer in history by more than one, has 21 victories over those eventually inducted into the Boxing Hall of Fame. Manny Pacquiao has 12 such victories. Muhammad Ali has 11. Joe Louis has 10. Jack Dempsey and Floyd Mayweather have 9. Roy Jones and Ray Leonard have 5, and Marvin Hagler and Mike Tyson have only 2 at all. Ring magazine and not only calls this boxer the greatest light heavyweight in history, the great Archie Moore is behind him in this ranking, in second place. The same Ring put the hero of our issue in the top 10 greatest boxers, regardless of category. Even Muhammad Ali recognized that this opponent would have caused him serious problems, although Ali himself is noticeably larger. But despite all these dizzying achievements, this boxer is rarely remembered, and most boxing fans have never heard of him. I assure you, when you get to know him and learn his story, he will stay in your heart forever, and a new name will appear on the list of your all-time favorite boxers, Ezzard Charles, nicknamed the Cobra of Cincinnati.
Ezzard Charles, Cincinnati Cobra, hear his story now. Twice the Boxer of the Year, he made the world say wow. 20 wins over legends, in the Hall of Fame they stand. Ezzard Charles, the Cobra, forever in the fight.
Ezzard Charles was born on July 7, 1921. In Lawrenceville, Georgia. He was the second child in the family, but he never saw his older sister because she died when she was 4 months old. Ezzard was named after the doctor. He successfully delivered the baby. However, the parents did not have enough money to pay for the services. The doctor did not want to charge them any money at all, and William and Alberta decided to name their son after him, Ezzard. Unlike most black families, where the number of children could number in the dozens, the Charles family was not large. Ezzard was an only child, but when he was 5 years old, the family became even smaller. His father abandoned the family and moved to the north of the country. After that, Ezzard had to go hungry even more often. Food for thought was also a problem. It was the late 20s, and the first public school for blacks in Lawrenceville would not appear until the 50s. The 20s of the 20th century is one of the most colorful periods in the history of professional boxing. This is the era of Jack Dempsey. Jack was not particularly popular among the black population because of the fact that during the period of his championship never met with any black challenger. But Jack's era, through a layer in the form of Jess Vila, began after the era of Jack Johnson, the first black world heavyweight champion, who was a true hero to blacks. Therefore, boxing among black boys was one of the most popular sports. Ezzard Charles got his first fighting experience during the Battle Royal. If you watch the Jack Johnson issue, you probably remember that the full name of this event is the Black Battle Royal. Black guys, most often they were teenagers or even pre-adolescent children. In numbers of 5 to 10 people were put in the ring and forced to fight. When only one was left standing and all the others were lying down, the fight was over. Sometimes, for the amusement of the audience, the fighters were blindfolded and beat each other blind. When Ezzard Charles first participated in such action, he was 8 years old, and it took place on the lawn in front of the mansion of the mayor of Lawrenceville. His first royal battle Charles won, after which he became a frequent participant in such fun for the so-called high society of the city. Participating in the battles prompted Ezzard to think that he needed to train. He took a sack, filled it with sand and old rags, and hung it on a tree. With each blow on this apparatus, his dreams of becoming a boxer became brighter and brighter. But those dreams had to be abandoned. Alberta already clearly realized that her son had no chance for a decent future in the poor province. She took 9-year-old Ezzard to his mother in Cincinnati, Ohio, and went to New York in search of work. Now, Ezzard's upbringing was taken over by his grandmother, whose name was Moth Foster. She was strict but fair, although the grandson did not create problems with his behavior and avoided trouble. But any boxing lessons were out of the question. Moth was an opponent of boxing and believed that now the main occupation in the life of her grandson should be to get an education. At the age of 9, Ezzard finally went to a real school, but he could not read and was assigned to a class for the mentally retarded, where he spent 3 months, and then was transferred to standard schooling. As the teacher said, Charles was not an excellent student, but he was still a diligent student, and he was not among the laggards either. However, there was one point in which he did not show any aspiration at all, and that was street fighting. He was often bullied at school and never fought back, even though he had dozens of battle royal fights behind him. They were no different from street fights, and he won the vast majority of those fights. But at school and on the street, Ezzard acted as if he had never hit anyone in his life and was afraid to do so. He could get home from school for quite a long time, avoiding dangerous neighborhoods and clusters of kids who seemed unfriendly to him. But in August 1932, Ezzard Charles's life changed forever. The news swept through the city that in Cincinnati will hold a bout Eligio Sardines Montalvo, known to the boxing world as Keith Chocolate. The 22-year-old Cuban was the world featherweight champion and one of the idols for the black kids. To promote the fight, he was being driven around town in a car, and at one point asked to stop at a candy store that was located near the house where Charles lived. Ezzard was in the crowd of boys who clung to the Cuban's car. Keith Chocolate loved costumes and resembled Jack Johnson in that respect. One of the kids asked the champion, "How many suits do you have?" The answer changed the life of at least one person. "I have costumes for every day of the year, 365. Ezzard Charles, who was as poor as any other West End kid, avoided street fights, looked like he was starving, and never started a conversation first. At that moment thought, "I'm going to be a boxer, and I'll have as many clothes." Shortly before the Cubans' fight in Cincinnati, the promoter gathered a group of guys on the street to set up chairs in the arena, and as payment for their labor, he promised tickets to the fight. Ezzard was among these guys, and for him it was even more than a miracle to see the fight with his own eyes. The wait for the miracle did not last long. When the guys did the work and came to get tickets to the agreed meeting place, there was no one there, and they didn't get to the fight, although in general it was not so important. The important thing was that inside was burning desire to become a boxer, and in general to become something more than just a black guy from a poor neighborhood. In 1935, when Charles was 14 years old, he had a new hero, Joe Louis. In late 1935, Ezzard plucked up his courage, went to his grandmother, and asked her for 50 cents to pay for classes at the local boxing club. Mind you, Grandma was an opponent of boxing, but Ezzard was a model child, and she couldn't deny him his quest. When Charles came to the gym of Danny Davis, who trained the world champion in the lightweight Freddie Miller, he was ridiculed. Ezzard was thin and looked like he did not eat every day. Overall, though, it wasn't far from reality. He spoke very quietly and was incredibly shy. Only a madman could see him as a boxer, let alone a potential world champion. The gym was filled with kids from similarly poor families, but their faces were scarred, angry, and wanting to destroy. It was literally written on their faces, "I want to get out of poverty." Charles had no scars or aggression on his face. He just looked like a skinny, poor boy who apparently got lost in his own head, thinking he was a boxer. The coaches at the gym refused to enroll him and advised him to find another sport. Ezzard returned home with nothing. But the next day, he told the story to a friend who was boxing at another gym. He took Ezzard with him and introduced him to the trainer. He was Bird Williams, an Irishman by birth. He had fought in World War I and was one of the most respected trainers in Cincinnati. Bird looked at the kid skeptically, but still asked him to stand and throw out a few punches. I saw right away that he knew what he was doing. He seemed to have potential. I worked with him 2 or 3 times and realized he had character. On the 6th day of training, I put him in a sparring session with an experienced amateur boxer named Sam Rutledge, just to see how he reacted after missing punches. I knew it was too early to put him in sparring, but I thought it was the best way to see exactly what was inside this guy. Sam chased him around the ring and even dropped him a few times. After a beating like that, most guys don't come back to the gym. The coach said. Ezzard came in the next day and I put him in with Rutledge again. Sam chased him around the ring again and dropped him a few times again. The next day he again appeared in the gym and again was ready to spar with Rutledge. After several months of training, Bird Williams got to know Charles, who was very modest and possessed amazing drive and discipline, and even bought him new clothes. In early 1936, Bird Williams declared his new ward in the amateur boxing tournament. Again, Bird did this very early on, but he was curious if he really wasn't mistaken in believing the boy, and he was eager to test him in a fight. In the first round of the first official fight of his life, Ezzard was knocked down hard. He got up, reached the gong, and in the second 3 minutes, literally pounced on his opponent. In the third round, Charles forced the referee to step in and stop the fight. He passed the test of the fight and proved to his trainer that he was not wrong about him. At the end of 1936, Charles was already chasing his old friend Sam Rutledge around the ring. The owner of the hall in which he worked, Bird Williams, began to insist that Charles debuted in professional boxing. Williams, however, thought it was too early for that. Nowadays, newcomers are led from the first steps, bringing them into the ring 5 to 6 times a year, creating sometimes even too comfortable conditions. In those days, newcomers had to immediately throw themselves into a real meat grinder and sometimes 15 fights a year. And if they broke down at the start, you couldn't turn the mincemeat back on. So Williams was in no hurry to throw a 15-year-old boy into a cage with lions. He believed that it was necessary to gain experience in the amateurs, where the conditions for growth are much more humane, and there's an opportunity to select opponents by strength. Bird Williams, as a true Irishman, did not pick up expressions, and on the basis of disagreements about Charles' career, quarreled with the owner of the hall, so that he threw Williams and Charles. This did not stop the trainer from continuing to work with the boxer. Unlike other kids off the street, Charles didn't need to be instilled with discipline and told to stay away from the bad guys. He had the heart of a fighter. He was a wonderful boy and very easy to be with. He did everything I told him to do. All he had on his mind was gym, gym, gym. Often I had to kick him out of the gym late at night, but training wasn't enough. Charles had to support himself. He washed cars, windows, worked as a longshoreman, and at the same time did not drop out of school and passed all the exams, moving from middle school to high school. His first trip to the U.S. Championships ended unsuccessfully. In March 1938, Charles lost in his first bout at the tournament at 66-7. If you try to search for Ezzard's record in the amateurs, you're likely to come across 42-0. That's not true. Charles has lost in the amateurs in official tournaments 6 times. 42-0 was generated by Bird Williams, who, to give the aura of invincibility, told journalists that his boxer never lost. And after a while, Bird himself would reveal his own deception. In 1939, Ezzard was already a middleweight and performed in the category 72-6, and that year was a real breakthrough. It all started with a win at the Diamond Belt tournament. The tournament existed before there was a national tournament Golden Gloves. In those days, Golden Gloves were held only in a few states, and only since 1964, in addition to the regional Golden Gloves, appeared national Golden Gloves, which was almost no different in strength from the national champion. So here is Ezzard Charles's 1939 achievement in the amateurs. January 27th, winner of the Diamond Belt tournament. February 9th, winner of the Cincinnati Golden Gloves. March 10th, Chicago Golden Gloves winner. March 29th, Ohio State champion. April 14th, U.S. champion. In just 2.5 months, Charles won 19 fights and 5 tournaments, including the national championship. After that, it was already possible to safely move to the professionals. Debut took place on March 12, 1940. Ezzard knocked out Melody Johnson in the 4th round and received a fee of $5 for it. Charles had 15 fights in the first year of his career. In the summer of 1941, Bird Williams had a chance to put his prodigy against a former world champion. Ken Overland had lost the middleweight title just the previous fight, and he lost it thanks to the judges who stole the win and the title from him. And now, Ken was ready to rehabilitate himself at the expense of a talented rookie. Overland wasn't just a champion. He was the #1 middleweight boxer in the world. It's not often you see a rookie who, a year after starting his career, would go up against the strongest boxer in his division. By the way, Overland would be inducted into the Boxing Hall of Fame. Bird Williams realized that there was no chance of winning. The difference in experience is enormous. Overland has 123 wins and 19 losses, but only 20 wins by knockout. Williams thought he was the perfect opponent. Even if Charles loses, he won't get beaten up, but he'll gain a lot of experience. But there is one very important point to understand. The cult of zero in the defeat column started thanks to Floyd Mayweather. Only after his competent manipulations, many fans began to think that you are really good only if you have never lost. But in the first half of the 20th century, nobody paid much attention to how many defeats a man had. The philosophy was different. If you have a 0 in the defeat column, then you avoided meeting with the strongest opponents, or met with strong opponents when they were no longer really dangerous. However, in order to get a fight against the leader of the middleweight division, Bird Williams had to make a deal with Overland's manager, Chris Dundee. It consisted in the fact that now, Dundee became Charles' manager for the next few fights. That is, in fact, had to rent his boxer. In the fight against the leader of the middleweight, Ezzard rushed into attacks, was inattentive, and experienced Overland simply outplayed the young and impatient opponent. Williams expected that. What he didn't expect was that Charles wouldn't be defeated. He created competition. Just 5 months later, middleweight Charles stepped up to take on former world light heavyweight champion Teddy Jaros. There were similarities in this story to the fight against Overland. Jaros had 107 wins, but had only won 17 fights early. At the end of the first round, Charles sent Jaros to a knockdown, and in the end, he won by split decision. Jaros will also be inducted into the Hall of Fame. 2 months later, Charles faces another former world light heavyweight champion, Anton Christopheridis, the #5 ranked light heavyweight in the world. Christopheridis is seen as a slight favorite, but that favorite was good enough for a partial 3 rounds. Charles won. You may ask, how could a trainer without much influence organize such serious fights for his boxer? Baird had connections, but not a lot of money. If they did it all themselves, it would have taken them a long time to get to the big fights with Charles, and probably wouldn't get there. Parallel course with Ezzard Charles moved well-known to regular viewer boxer named Archie Moore. Charles had been competing for less than 2 years and had already faced 3 world champions, and Moore had been competing for 6 years, had 57 fights, and had only 1 champion on his record. It was Teddy Jaros that Archie lost to. Charles was already caught up in the maelstrom of main events from the start. Moore won't get into them until 15 years into his career, and when he's already got 150 fights under his belt. First, we need to explain how the system worked at the time, although not much has changed since then. In order for people to know about a boxer, you need the press to write about him. After the dry law came into force, criminal structures had to think about how to develop an underground system of alcohol production and distribution. While the process was being developed and fine-tuned, the mafia turned its attention to professional boxing, which has always been closely connected with betting. The big bosses, including Al Capone, got into the business, and it was not easy to just get into the arena, let's say Madison Gardens. And New York was the epicenter of world boxing at that time. You had to have connections with criminal structures, or be friends with those who knew the right people. This applied not only to getting into the big ring, but also to getting into the newspapers. If you want your boxer to be written about, you need to take an envelope, write on it the name of the journalist, and in the envelope, put a piece of paper with the name of the boxer and money. The envelope was usually left in well-known places where journalists like to look, and there through the bartender or restaurant manager, the envelope was passed to the addressees. Charles' mentor, Bird Williams, did not have the means to promote his boxer. Ezzard insisted that Bird give some of the rights to his career to Max Elkus, who owned a clothing store in Cincinnati and for whom Charles worked. Williams did not want to share the talent that had fallen into his hands, but he could not bring this talent to the top of boxing, so he still conceded part of the contract to Elkus. All the more, the latter helped Charles financially. Moreover, even after starting a professional career, Charles, in his free days, came to the store to stand behind the cash register and somehow work off the assistance provided. But one Elkus was not enough, and Williams has already independently sold another part of the contract to the owner of the restaurant in Cincinnati, Charlie Dyer. But even before Charles turned pro, Williams gave a share of Ezzard's career to promoter Sam Becker. So the boxer's career had been managed by 4 people. Williams was in a situation where either of the 2 paths had a good chance of failing for him personally. If he didn't attract sponsors, it was impossible to reach title fights and money fights. And what's the point of earning $100 per fight? And this is in the best case, and with such fees that both boxer and trainer could feed themselves, need to go to the ring at least 10-12 times a year. It's not a career, it's survival. If you bring in sponsors, there's a huge chance of losing a boxer. Only the powers that be in the boxing world recognize talent, and that's the end of it. It was the second option that awaited Williams. After the manager from New York was involved in the case, Bird Williams finally lost his status as a manager. His biggest mistake was that he signed Charles when he was under 18 years old. He added Ezzard's grandmother's signature for good measure, but she wasn't his legal guardian because his mother was. But when Ezzard signed the contract with the new sponsors, he was already 18. Bird realized his mistake, but it was too late. Because of his legal illiteracy, he lost his status and percentage of revenues as a manager. Of course, one could say that Charles could have stepped in and resolved the issue. But it would be naive to expect a guy in his 20s to solve anything, especially now he was contractually bound to a whole bunch of people. So he was no longer in charge. But there's another important point. Williams wasn't kicked off the team. He could have stayed on as coach, and if things had worked out, the paychecks could have been solid. But Baird Williams was the kind of man they say, "My tongue is my enemy." He quarreled with the entire team and began to express his displeasure to Charles. As a result, Ezzard refused the services of Williams and hired a new trainer, Jimmy Brown, with whom he had long been friends. He was a boxer, is not particularly successful, and teach something new to Charles. He certainly could not. But with him, Ezzard worked easily, and that was the most important thing. Although looking ahead, it must be said that Ezzard eventually realized that probably should have tried to defend the rights of Williams. But at that point, he didn't feel he had enough authority to argue with the people who now had complete control over his career and on whom his future depended. March 1942, Charles faces Ken Overland for the second time. A very important fight because Mike Jacobs, manager of super heavyweight champion Joe Louis, is present at the bout. However, Overland is once again a stumbling block for Charles. Although the experienced Charles looked better, all he could do against the experienced Overland was draw. Mike Jacobs was unimpressed. Then Charles himself caused trouble. Money appeared in his pocket, managers gave him a car, and Ezzard himself discovered the field of entertainment services. He began to visit clubs, bars, restaurants, get acquainted with girls. Entertainment, which was not available to him before, influenced his career. He lost to a Cuban named Pete Tunero, after which the most authoritative person in Charles's life, his grandmother, intervened. She took away his car keys and said she would only return them when she saw him getting serious again. While Charles was listening to his grandmother, his managers decided to go for broke. They organized him a fight against the main boxer from the Killer Squad and future member of the Boxing Hall of Fame, Charlie Burley. To characterize Burley, imagine Burnell Whitaker with a knockout punch. It's hard to hit, easy to fall. Sugars, Ray Robinson manager, once admitted that it wasn't that they avoided Burley. Burley was such an uncomfortable opponent that even beating him would still make them look bad. So even though they had a chance to face Burley, they decided it would be better not to do so as not to complicate their lives. Burley was one of the most shunned boxers in history, and it got to the point that being in the top 3 boxers in his weight, he worked as a garbage man. In early 1942, Burley was number 2 on the list of title contenders. The first was Archie Moore, but he was in the same position as Burley, too good, but without a great team. The truth in Archie's case should be added so far. Charles' team suggested him to Charlie Burley's manager, Jake Means. He replied that Burley is a terrific boxer, and some schoolboy has no place near him, if only to get an autograph. Jake was right about one thing. Charles was actually just finishing high school. This, despite the fact that Ezzard had already been fighting an average of once a month for 2 years. But Burley's opponent had fallen off, and there were simply no other options, and the tickets for the fight were already sold out, so Means agreed. Of course, it was a very risky move on the part of Charles's managers. Burley was seen as a 3-1 favorite. Charles won the first 2 rounds, but in the 3rd round, Burley turned on him, and it looked like he had it all figured out. Now he's gonna take the fight to the ground. And in the 4th round, the fight was indeed almost stopped because Charles seriously shook the favorite. In the final 10 rounds, Burley was hopelessly losing on points, and trying to knock out Ezzard, hit a punch and was knocked down. A few minutes later, he watched the referee victoriously raise the schoolboy's hand. Immediately after the fight, local journalists, and the fight was in Pittsburgh, invited Ezzard for an interview. He declined. He had to go home, which is 8 hours by train, because the next day he had a high school graduation. When he got home, his grandmother gave him back his car keys. Just a month after the first fight, Charles and Burley met again, confidently outboxed him, 2-0 in favor of the schoolboy. Twice Burley had never lost to anyone up to this point, and Ezzard Charles, who just finished school and has been in the ring for only a little more than 2 years, had already 6 fights against top opponents, and 3 opponents, although it is clear that no one knew it at the time, went into the Boxing Hall of Fame. At the end of 1942, Charles's opponent was Dewey Maxim, who was not yet a champion, but he would become one, and also get into the Boxing Hall of Fame. Charles had 2 fights with him, in October and December. He won both by decision, no questions asked. After that, another boxer whose name will be immortalized in the Hall of Fame stood in the way, Jenny Bivens, who was simultaneously the #1 contender at weight and super weight. Bivens dropped Charles 4 times and won the fight by decision. A couple months after that, Ezzard stepped back into the ring, and guess what his opponent was? That's right, another boxer to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. It was a member of the Kill Squad, Lloyd Marshall, and he sent Charles to the ring floor in the 1st round, 3rd, 5th, twice in the 7th, and twice in the 8th, after which the fight was stopped. agree suspicious that the guy who fought on equal terms with the champions and then gaining experience began to beat the best representatives of the sport, suddenly was on the floor 11 times in 2 fights. And for the first time, he lost early, the official version, because of problems with his hip. Unofficially, Ezzard just lost motivation. He saw his childhood hero, Joe Louis, getting hundreds of thousands of dollars for his fights. Obviously, Louis is a different kind of figure. Charles hasn't even gotten his first $1,000 for a fight yet, but he's fought everyone, including those whom the leaders preferred to avoid. In some fights, about 10,000 people gathered in the arenas. Revenues from ticket sales could exceed $20,000, but Charles got the crumbs. Of course, making $200, $300 a fight is better than cleaning windows for $30 a month. But in 1942, he had 12 fights, and 9 of them were against top 10 opponents at 3 different weights, from middleweight to super heavyweight. And when I said, with the top 10, it's not like now. 4 rankings from 4 different organizations, and each one has different leaders. Back then, there was only 1 ranking by Ring magazine, and when it came to the top 10, it was really the top 10 title contenders. Ezzard realized that it was being used, it was being capitalized on, and he was wasting his health. But there was another factor, and it mattered even more than money. Let me remind you, it's the early 40s, World War II. World middleweight champion Tony Zale worked as an instructor in the Navy. World light heavyweight champion Gus Lesnevich was in the Coast Guard. Because of this, their championship titles were frozen and secured until the end of the war. They were allowed to fight, but the champions could not put their titles on the line. Charles started thinking about serving in the army, even before his losing fights. He no longer wanted to fight, because there was no point in it. He understood perfectly well that in the foreseeable future he would not see the title, because such a large-scale military conflict will obviously not end in 6 months to a year. Ezzard received much less money for the fights than he should have when management found out about his plans to join the army. And Charles wanted not only to serve in the US, he was going to Europe. They tried to squeeze the last juices out of him, and Ezzard could not resist them. That's how the fights against Bivens and Marshall were organized, in which Charles was on the floor more often than in all the previous fights combined. If for Bivens he was somehow prepared, for the fight against Marshall he was not prepared at all, and came out only because he wanted to sabotage the contract, so that his team realized that there was nothing more to take from him, so they let him go. But before he went into the army, Charles went to Lawrenceville, the town where he was born. He had no friends or relatives left there. He just wanted to visit and thank Dr. Ezzard, who delivered his mother, and after whom he was named. On May 14, 1943, Ezzard Charles enlisted in the military. He was sent to training where he was to learn the following skills: riding a horse, shooting a pistol, and the M1 Garand rifle. Charles' monthly salary was $50. As was the case with army fees, a portion of Ezzard's army pay was sent to his grandmother. Considering that Charles did not have a very big fame that he was a boxer, knew a few of his co-workers. Like in school, Ezzard didn't use his skills in any way and didn't show it until a certain point when Joe Louis, the super heavyweight champion, came to the unit, ready to spar with anyone who wanted to. Charles thought it wouldn't be a good idea for him. From the amazing army diet, he lost weight, and his weight dropped to 72 kilos. Louis at the time weighed 100. However, Ezzard's friends still talked him into sparring with the champion. Charles and Louis spent 3 rounds in the ring. Louis didn't want to press his much smaller opponent, and Charles didn't want to provoke a stiff response. Nevertheless, the boxers still exchanged moderate accented punches. Despite the fact that among Ezzard's opponents were boxers who were ranked in the super heavyweight division, he did not even think about fighting for the title in this category, and even more so about meeting with Joe Louis himself. Charles was a middleweight, who although boxed for 3 divisions, but for the title claimed only in the middle and light heavyweight divisions. March 9, 1944. Charles, as part of the division, arrived in Oran. This Algerian city had already been liberated by the anti-Hitler coalition forces. Charles worked as a truck driver for the division's supply unit. He began to learn French, but did not make much progress, including because in July 1944, the command threw a cry for recruitment to the boxing team, and Charles was included in its composition. Then went to Rome, where he lived for the next year and a half. There he held at least 10 fights and won the Army boxing tournament. During his time in Italy, Ezzard learned 2 languages, Italian and Spanish, and it would come in handy in one rather amusing situation. In January 1946, he was discharged from the Army and returned home to Cincinnati. There, his managers and promoters were already waiting for him, hoping that Ezzard would resume his career. Of course, he couldn't do otherwise. He's only 24 years old, and he already has experience. Championship titles unfrozen. It's time to make another attempt at the top. Charles had a plan lined up of 6 fights in 3 months, 5 warm-up fights to recover from a long layoff, with a 6th fight being a championship fight. A team that offered flyweight champion Gus Lesnovich $35,000 for a fight against their boxer. Lesnovich refused. They went the other way. They offered the fight, but already for a modest amount of money, to the #1 contender in the division, Archie Moore. The mongoose, then not yet old, has been in the ring for 11 years, has fought 96 fights, and 62 of his 80 victories were by knockout. For the past 7 years, he has been in the top of first the middleweight division and now the welterweight division. But for lack of a promoter, he was forced to fight for very modest fees against very strong opponents. He was kept away from the championship fights. Many considered the strongest weight in the world, not the champion Lesnovich, but the challenger, Moore. Fighting against a boxing monster like Moore was an extreme test for Charles. While Ezzard was serving in Italy in 1945, Archie knocked out Holman Williams, Erbert Hardrick, and Lloyd Marshall. All 3 were from the Killer Squad, and all 3 would be inducted into the Boxing Hall of Fame, as would Archie Moore himself. A win over Archie, who was on the move and was realistically the best weight in the world in this situation, would be out of the realm of fantasy. Frankly, Charles's team threw their boxer into the cage with a lion. The fight ended in a rout. On 2 of the cards, the score was 9-1, and the 3rd judge put the score at 10-0 in favor of Ezzard Charles. There is no record of this fight, but it is described as a fight in which Archie Moore had no chance. It was a shock, but the biggest shock was experienced by the champion Gus Lesnovich. And in order not to suffer, he imagined that he lived in a world in which the challenger named Ezzard Charles did not exist. Charles had no choice but to face the strongest challengers, and his next opponent was Lloyd Marshall, to whom Ezzard lost early 3 years ago because he didn't prepare. While Ezzard was in Italy, Lloyd made his mark with many fights against tough opponents, including a win over the mad Jake LaMotta. Lloyd Marshall suddenly discovered that 3 years ago he wasn't fighting Ezzard Charles, but some unfortunate copy. In the 6th round, Charles landed a blow to the liver, after which Marshall did not get up. After resuming his career, Charles's personal trainer was Jake Means, the same one who called Ezzard a schoolboy. Now, Charles's team hired him as the man who would handle the boxer's affairs. Means went to New York to Joe Louis manager Mike Jacobs, who was one of the major figures in boxing of those years. The latter said, "Let him beat Jimmy Bivens, and then I will have an interest in Mr. Charles." The fight with Bivens took place in November 1946. Charles was knocked down in the 3rd round, but in the end, he won by a judge's decision that was not in question. 2 of his defeats were returned by Ezzard. In early 1947, Charles beat Bivens for the 2nd time. The most important thing was that Charles was now getting really good money. Now his biggest fee was $5,000, and that money came in handy. When in Cincinnati, during one of the evening walks with friends, he saw Gladys Goltreo, the future Gladys Charles. But at the time, she actively resisted it. Gladys was in a contest to see who could sell the most tickets to a local event. Ezzard bought all the tickets so she could win. but so far it hadn't worked. Charles wasn't about to give up. Then Archie Moore appeared on the horizon again, and now the mongoose was ready to fight back. After 8 rounds, the fight was even, but in 9, Charles sent Moore to a knockdown, then took the final round, winning the fight again. Meanwhile, Gus Lesnovich continued to live in a reality in which neither Ezzard Charles nor Archie Moore existed. In case you've suddenly forgotten, the deal a year ago was that Charles had to beat Bivens, and then Mike Jacobs would consider having Ezzard finally step into the ring of the world's premier boxing arena of the time, Madison Square Garden. Ezzard kept his end of the bargain and even exceeded it, defeating Bivens twice. At the time, Jacobs was a bit sidelined after suffering a microstroke, and his replacement Sol Strauss didn't just give the go-ahead for Charles to fight at MSG. He told Joe Louis he was looking for an opponent because he didn't have much to fight, and if Charles proves that he's ready to fight big opponents, then he'll be the opponent for Joe Louis. That's something Ezzard never dreamed of. On July 25, 1947, Charles had his first career bout at the Madison Square Garden Arena. His opponent was the #1 contender in the super heavyweight Elmer Ray, who was heavier than Charles by almost 10 kilos. Ray had been stalking Joe Louis for a long time and made unflattering remarks about him. Louis afterwards stated that he would not fight Elmer simply out of principle. Charles already had enough fabulous victories in his career. A win over Ray would go right into that piggy bank. Here's what Ring magazine wrote after the fight. Ray was the aggressor, but Charles was faster as a boxer and hit sharper. And here's what another publication wrote. The man who lost was declared the winner. The two judges were so out of touch with reality, it's a wonder what kind of fight they were watching. I think you guessed the point. Ezzard Charles's first appearance in the arena ended in a robbery. He won the fight. One of the judges put the score at 8-2 in his favor, but the other two put it 6-4 in Ray's favor. This quote-unquote victory did not bring happiness to Ray, who was hoping for a title fight. Because commenting on the results of the Charles-Ray fight, Joe Louis sarcastically said, "If Ray could not knock out a boxer weighing 50 kilos, what will he do with someone who weighs 90 kilograms? But what about Charles?" Since the vast majority of the boxing community has decided he won the fight, maybe face him then. But still, technically, Charles lost, so the choice of the bomber fell on the fight against the challenger Jerzy Jovicat. As for Charles, after a successfully unsuccessful performance in the ring, he returned to Cincinnati and continued his courtship of Gladys. And after 7 months, she finally agreed to go on a date with him. In September 1947, Charles faced Lloyd Marshall for the 3rd time. The score was 1-1. In the decisive fight, Charles rolled over Marshall and won early in the 2nd round. Ezzard's manager again made an offer to champion Gus Lesnovich, and it was again ignored. Then Jake Means organized the 3rd fight between Charles and Archie Moore, after which he appealed to the Cleveland Boxing Commission to recognize the fight between Charles and Moore as a title fight, because they were really the two best weights in the world. Lesnovich was a good fighter, and he is a contender for the Boxing Hall of Fame. He doesn't have a very good chance, but he still has a chance. But his blatant avoidance of fights against Moore and Charles is a fact. Nevertheless, the commission thought Means' claims were ridiculous. January 13, 1948, try number 3 for Archie Moore. The mongoose, still not old because Archie was 34 years old, opted for a wait-and-see tactic. He just waited for an opponent's mistake to grab onto. And he did. In the 8th round, Moore failed Charles and seriously shook him on the counter. Archie went for the kill. He was finally close to beating his most embarrassing opponent of his career. But out of nowhere, a left lateral and then a right lateral came out of nowhere, and Moore was knocked down. Archie took a knee, but realizing his opponent was still shaken, he jumped up, only to be immediately hit with a powerful uppercut, after which Moore was only able to get up from the mat after 20 seconds. And even then, with the help of seconds. One of the journalists wrote about the final blow. "I heard bones cracking either in Archie's head or in Ezzard's hand, or maybe both." No matter how Moore tried to strategize against Charles, nothing worked. He boxed aggressively, moderately aggressively, cautiously, extra cautiously, but he could not solve the riddle of Ezzard Charles. The point in this confrontation was a knockout. The second half of the 40s is one of the best stretches of Archie Moore's career. In fact, if one were to try to find a period where one could say it was peak Archie Moore, it's the second half of the 40s. In those 5 years, he had 8 wins over future Hall of Fame members. He had the occasional loss, but all of those losses he eventually got back. In his best years, including his championship years, Moore never lost to anyone more than one time, except Ezzard Charles. He defeated the Mongoose by a score of 3-0. You realize that such a win did not disturb the dream of champion Gus Lesniewicz in any way. After all, he knew that Ezzard Charles didn't exist. It's all made up. Jake Means decided that he needed to pick his opponents very carefully. It had to be either a name opponent or an opponent against whom Charles would look impressive. And the next opponent in the fight, which took place in February 1948, was a black fighter, Semi Crendel. He performed under the name Sem Barudi and was in the top 10 of the light heavyweight division. 6 months before meeting Charles, Barudi knocked out a boxer named Newton Smith. He died in the hospital after the fight from a brain hemorrhage. After the first 5 rounds of the Charles Barudi fight, it was hard to tell who was leading. But starting with the 6th, Ezzard picked up the pace. He took control of the fight, and then what was happening in the ring gradually turned into a beating. In the last 9 rounds, Barudi's condition was frightening, but the referee did not intervene. Although even the spectators in the audience and journalists started shouting to stop, nor did Barudi's seconds intervene. Charles' manager Jay Means smelled something wrong. Unlike Barudi, Charles was fighting in Chicago for the first time, and the fact that an exhausted, battered, and bloodied Sema was not removed from the ring looked too suspicious. Means was afraid the fight would go to a decision and they'd be robbed of another well-deserved victory. Before the final round, Jake tells Ezzard, "If you can knock him out, do it." Ezzard immediately pounced on his opponent, and less than a minute into the round, Barudi was on the decking. Seconds jumped up to Sema to lift him up, but he was unconscious. He was carried out of the ring on a stretcher, then taken to the hospital. He died of a brain hemorrhage, just like Barudi's former rival Newton Smith 6 months earlier. After Barudi died in the hospital at 5 a.m., Charles was arrested, but only formally. He was not handcuffed or locked up in a cell. After he signed a guarantee that he would stay in Chicago until the police completed the investigation, he was released. It very quickly became clear that a couple weeks before the fight with Charles, Barudi had an unofficial fight in which he was badly shaken up several times and was on the verge of being knocked out, and he was bleeding heavily from his nose, which he had a hard time stopping. Barudi's managers kept quiet about this fight because the fight with Charles promised a good fee and was a good chance to break into the elite in case of victory. By the way, the judges' score at the end of 9 rounds of the Charles Barudi fight remained unknown, which strengthened suspicions about the manipulation of judges' cards. In the end, all of these machinations took a man's life. The day after the fight, Charles made the decision that he would have one more fight. He would give part of his fee to Barudi's family and then end his career. Jake Means didn't like that prospect. He went to Sem Barudi's father and asked him to talk to Charles. And that's what he told Ezzard: keep going and become champion. It was a terrible accident. We have no hard feelings. Don't give up your career. The same thing happened to our son last year when one of his opponents died after fighting him. We know and understand how you feel. Please change your mind and keep performing. Means has taken it upon himself to organize a fight against an opponent that Charles is sure to beat, but who he won't put up a chopping block with. The fight is scheduled to take place in Chicago at the same arena. Local promoters said that such a fight is not interesting to them, even taking into account that the goal is to raise money for the Barudi family. Nothing personal, just business. Means has already offered the fight to champion Gus Lesniewicz for the 25th time, trying to push the sting. It's a fight for charity. Doesn't Gus want to help the parents who lost their son? But Gus and his team sent a response saying the following: "We're sorry. We'd really like to help the Barudi family, but we have a fight against Billy Fox. If Charles wants to help so badly, he can take the fight to some other opponent." I imagine a lot of you are anxious to find out whether or not Ezzard Charles got a chance to smash Gus Lesnovich's face in. This story has an ending, but I'll hold the suspense for now. Jake Means called Elmer Ray in a fight against whom Charles was robbed by the judges at the Madison Square Garden Arena. Ray was on the second line of contenders for the World Heavyweight title. On the first line was JC Joe Volkart, who after one controversial fight was preparing for a rematch with Joe Louis. So Ray's second stint was soon to turn into the first. The second fight between Charles and Ray was similar to the first. The big good boxer had little to counter the small but great boxer. At the end of 8 rounds, Charles confidently led the fight, and in 9, he won by knockout. Ezzard took a convincing rematch. The most important thing was that he became a contender for the title in the super heavyweight division. As promised, Charles gave the Barudi family $5,000. Another $5,000 to the family were transferred by the organizers of the fight. Given that at that time the average income of a black man was $1,500 a year, $10,000, an impressive amount. A year afterward, Barudi's father sued Ezzard Charles for $15,000 in damages. The attempt to make money out of grief, and their own grief, ended unsuccessfully for the Barudi family. The court rejected the claim. In July 1948, the title in the heavyweight lost everyone's favorite Gus Lesnovich. He had made an unsuccessful trip to Britain and lost to local boxer Freddie Mills. He was once sitting with the title on the islands and did not want to go to the States. Once again, the weight title was out of reach. Charles was a contender in 1942, and it was 1948. But then events took a most unusual turn. Jake Means was called to a meeting of people involved in the career of Joe Louis. At the meeting, where there was Joe Means himself, learned that Louis is going to end his career. And the plan is this: Louis is going to retire from boxing. After that, the Ezzard Charles versus Joe Volkart Jersey fight for the super heavyweight title should be announced. But before that, Charles needed to beat Joe Baxey, who has been a top 10 title contender in the division for 5 years. The problem was that, although Charles had changed categories, he was still the same welterweight he was before. He weighed 80 pounds, and Baxey was 15 pounds heavier. Charles met him in December 1948. Ezzard boxed very cautiously, carefully breaking his opponent. With each round, the dissections on Baxey's face were getting bigger. Blood was pouring into his eyes. In the 11th round, Baxey asked the referee to stop the fight because he couldn't see anything anymore. It was his first early defeat. Despite this, the crowd booed Charles for fighting too cautiously. But what was Charles supposed to do? Fight Baxey? That would have been signing his own death warrant. His goal was a world title fight, and this time, the goal was real. He couldn't afford to take any chances. He knew how to defeat his opponent, and he would do whatever was necessary to do so. Ezzard had been thinking about a middleweight or flyweight title fight for a long time. A heavyweight championship fight wasn't even on his radar. He found himself in this situation as a result of a confluence of circumstances beyond his control. Charles was criticized by the press. One of the journalists wrote, "Ezzard has not yet proved that he is the right contender for the title. Ezzard has already beaten but 1, 5, and number 6 in the rankings. What more proof is needed?" That said, the criticism was unstoppable. Ezzard was once asked what he thought of the fight against Louis. Ezzard replied, "For us regular guys, Joe will always be the champion. Fighting Louis is like fighting your father. So if I had a choice, I'd rather not face him." Ezzard just answered the question honestly because Louis was a hero to him. But journalists used those words against him. Now the press was saying that Charles was afraid of Louis, or Ezzard's crazy, because only a crazy person wouldn't want to make a fight against Joe Louis, because there's a championship belt and a lot of money at stake. Journalists could not even think that Charles was still the same modest and shy boy from the slums of Cincinnati, who idealized Joe Louis since childhood. to prove that Charles was the right challenger, Means arranged for him to fight against Johnny Haynes. He was 10 centimeters taller and 16 kilogram heavier. Charles knocked him out in the 8th round, but still fought carefully dismantling his opponent for parts before finishing him, for which he was again criticized. Ezzard was beating super heavyweights without giving them a chance, but the press said he was the wrong challenger. Means started to think about the fact that now you need a big win. He needed a fight that would get a lot of attention. A third fight against Joey Maxim, who Charles had beaten twice in 1942, 7 years ago. A lot has changed since then. Joey's career was now managed by Jack Kearns, former manager of the legendary Jack Dempsey. Kearns was a big celebrity, and that alone took Maxim's career to the next level. Despite the fact that Joey was a weight, he occasionally fought boxers from the top 10 super heavyweight division, and in his last fight, he defeated Jimmy Bivens. The cherry on the cake was that Maxim, like Charles, lived in Ohio, for the fight provided a newly built arena, Cincinnati Garden. It was attended by 14,000 spectators, and revenues from ticket sales brought $72,000. The fight was attended by Joe Louis, who said he would meet the winner. Ezzard won the first round, but starting from 5, Maxim created problems with his jab. Joey's real name is Giuseppe Antonio Bernardinelli. After Jack Kerr said that Joey throws a series of jabs as if he was shooting from Maxim's machine gun, the boxer took a pseudonym. And yes, it is correct to stress the first syllable, because that's the last name of his creator. So Joey, with his machine gun, at one point looked like he was going to foil the plans, but it was a 15-round fight, and Charles had a better range. Maxim took the pace too high, and in the last third, Charles took the fight to his own hands, winning by decision. Barring a robbery in his first fight against Elmer Ray, Ezzard Charles has won 30 fights out of 30 since returning from Europe in 3 years. He has fought a little less than once a month. In that time, he has beaten super heavyweight contenders who went around for years begging for a fight with Joe Louis. Against this background, the press who said Charles was the wrong contender looked like a pack of hyenas. All that bile spewing didn't matter. The day after the fight, Charles, Maxim Joe Louis announced that he leaves the world title vacant and will be challenged by Jersey Joe Volkart and Ezzard Charles. The year 1949 was a watershed year in the boxing business. Up to this point, control of the super heavyweight division had belonged to Joe Louis's manager Mike Jacobs. But in 1946, 2 things happened. Jacobs suffered a micro-stroke and also presented his boxer Joe Louis with a bill for $250,000 for his management services during the war. Louis, who at the time was already being pursued by the IRS, was clearly not happy about it. Relationships began to deteriorate, and Joe found new business partners. In 1949, Jacobs, due to his health, withdrew from business, and the main actor in boxing became the International Boxing Club of New York. The founders were businessmen Jim Norris and Arthur Wirtz. Joe Louis became a partner and consultant. At that time, it was not yet known, but in the leadership of the club was another man. His name was Frankie Carbo. He was a former mercenary for the Assassination Corporation. It was a Jewish criminal organization that eliminated people the mafia didn't want. The organization was responsible for about 100 contract killings from 1929 to 1941, and at least 8 of them were carried out by Frankie Carbo. At the end of 1940, Carbo had already climbed the criminal ladder, entered the industry of big boxing, and soon became the shadowy head of the International Boxing Club of New York. In the 50s, Carbo would become the manager of a boxer named Charles, whom the boxing world would recognize as Sonny Liston. And while Sonny was learning to box while serving time in prison, Frankie Carbo was watching one of his top assistants, Al Weil, deal with the career of a young up-and-coming super heavyweight of Italian descent named Rocco Francis Marciano, known as Rocky Marciano. But that was all for later. For now, we're in the year 1949. Ezzard Charles prepares to fight Jersey Joe Volkart for the world title. Jersey Joe Volkart was as much from a poor family as any fighter of those years, regardless of skin color. His real name was Arnold Raymond Cream, but as his career began, he took the name Joe Walcott in honor of his favorite boxer. But in order not to be confused, he put a prefix at the beginning in the form of his native state, Jersey. Jersey Joe had to grow up sharply at the age of 15 when his father died. At the age of 17, Joe met Coach Jack Blackburn. Many of you will find the name very familiar. You're about to find out. Blackburn began helping Walcott. He was soon approached by two old acquaintances, John Roxborough and Julian Black. They wanted Blackburn to start training a young amateur boxer named Joe Louis. Walcott was supposed to go with Blackburn, but fell ill with typhoid fever. This put him out of action, and boxing had to be forgotten about for a while. Legend has it that Blackburn promised to make a champion out of Walcott, but that doesn't sound very true, because when Black Bear was offered to work with Louis, he initially refused, saying that there was no point in training with a black boxer because there were no prospects. As time went on, Jack Johnson was kept out of blacks for the super heavyweight title, but Blackburn was offered good money, and since his best friend was alcohol and his pockets were getting emptier faster than he would have liked, Jack accepted. So it's hard to believe that Blackburn promised Volcott that he would make him a world champion, promised to train him and squeeze him to the max. It's more like the truth. But an unfortunate coincidence of circumstances left Volcott at the mercy of boxing fate, and Blackburn never thought of his former ward again. There are rumors that he once invited Walcott to spar with Louis, and Jersey Joe tried too zealously to prove himself in sparring, for which he was expelled from the hall. But neither Louis, Walcott, nor Blackburn ever mentioned it. Jersey Joe's real career started at the age of 31, when he already had over 40 fights under his belt. Official. Combined with unofficials, it could have been 1.5 times that many. No one knows for sure anymore. Volcott's fate is an example of what happens to a boxer when he doesn't have a serious manager and develops on his own. Before the fight with Joe Bucks, 31-year-old Joe Walcott was sent for the first time in his life to a serious training camp, where he not only trained, but also ate like a human being. The results did not take long to come. Such miracles in Walcott's life happened thanks to a man named Felix Boquicchio. Once upon a time, Boquicchio was engaged in robbery, suspected of murder, sat in prison, tried to make an escape. Then Felix densely engaged in the sphere of gambling and rose quite high, becoming one of the most influential people in the state of Pennsylvania. Then he became interested in boxing. Once, Jersey Joe Volcott caught his eye, and Boquicchio was surprised to learn that this talented boxer had no sponsors. Felix invested in him, and after that, in just 2 years, Volcott made it to a championship fight against Joe Louis. In the first fight, Volcott was seen as a clear outsider, and he was simply not given a chance to win. Jersey Joe, like Louis, was born in 1914. They were both 33 years old, but Louis had already been an elite super heavyweight for 12 years, and had been at the top of the division for 10 years. Walcott had only been on the radar for 2 years. Perceived him that way, a boxer who started to fully perform only a couple years ago. It was said about him that a man who took up boxing only at the age of 31 is hardly fit to be a champion. Jersey Joe already in the first round began to prove the opposite. Louis too confidently went at the challenger and ended up on the floor. Joe was very dodgy and had a good feel for his opponent. This led to the champion feeling the flooring with his body again in round 4. Louis was also good, but on this night, the opponent was better. Right after the gong, Louis tried to leave the ring, but the audience stopped him. He called his performance second-rate, and he did not deny the suggestion that he wanted to leave the ring because he thought he had lost. But his team had the foresight to bring him back, and it turned out to be for good reason, because the judges gave the win to Louis. Of the journalists at the ring, 26 gave the victory to Louis, 61 to Volkov. The rematch took place 6 months later, June 1948. Walcott dropped the champion again. It happened in the 3rd round. After 10 rounds, Jersey Joe led on 2 cards out of 3. But in 11, he got cocky and missed. After the defeat in the second fight with Luis Walcott took a break. He already knew that he was the main challenger for the title, so he did not want to take risks and just waited for his time. June 22, 1949, Chicago, World Heavyweight title fight. But only the National Boxing Association title was at stake. Let me remind you that in those years, the title of Absolute World Champion required the recognition of 3 organizations: the already mentioned the New York State Athletic Commission and the American Magazine Ring. I've noted this in past historical movies, but I'll say it again. If someone tells you that now there are many titles, but before there was one on this phrase, you can immediately realize that the person is not well acquainted with the history of boxing. Ticket sales brought $245,000, another $35,000 from the sale of television and radio rights. The total was $280,000. The boxers' share was 25% each. They each got $70,000. Just to give you an idea of how much that is, the average annual income per family in 1949 in the States was $3,000. Jersey Joe was bigger than Ezzard and showed 89 kilograms at the weigh-in. Charles was 6.5 kilograms lighter at 82.5. Let me remind you that in those days, there were no cruisers and super heavyweights started at 79.4. Unfortunately, only rounds 14 and 15 of this fight have survived. Charles is in full light shorts, while Volkat's shorts have a black belt and black vertical stripes on the sides. After 6 rounds, the fight was even, but in 7, Charles shook his opponent badly. And the end of the fight seemed to be a matter of a few punches, or even a few seconds. But Ezzard didn't go for the takedown. What happened in the last 2 rounds reflected what happened after that episode in 7. Ezzard was controlling the fight with class, and Volkott as if he could not recover from the shock. There was no doubt in Charles's victory, but the judges. Sometimes they surprise you. Not this time. Ezzard Charles is the new super heavyweight champion of the world. And now, looking at the top right of the screen, the man passing out is Ezzard Charles's manager Means. But this was theater. Charles's 3 other managers who helped Ezzard at one time, but for the last 5 years have done no work, and only got their percentage were ready to jump in the ring to get a picture with the champion. Means, who was essentially running the champion's career single-handedly, came up with this scene to create a distraction, and he succeeded. Not a single photo was taken with Charles's other managers. Nevertheless, there was an atmosphere of celebration in Ezzard's team, but they were the only ones rejoicing. The new champion was too cautious after the fight. Ezzard said he didn't want to take any chances. He had been coming to this moment for too long. He had 68 fights under his belt before the championship fight, exactly half of which were fights against former or future champions, top 10 opponents. Just imagine, to finally reach the champion's fight, it was necessary to beat 15 challenges from the top 10 in 3 different weights, and some of them 2 to 3 times. If Charles had made a mistake and landed one of the punches that made Joe Louis fall, all dreams of a championship would have been shattered. Cautious, Charles would hardly have been given a second chance. This became clear when immediately after the fight there was a tsunami of criticism. After the final gong, Louis, who was sitting in the 4th row, looked like he had just smelled a rotten fish. Charles' missed opportunity to knock out Walcott had insulted. As a promoter and as the best knockout artist in heavyweight history, speaking to a nearby journalist, Joe said he should have kept attacking Walcott. If he had, he would have won by knockout. That's exactly what I would have done. I wouldn't have let him go. The Charles-Walcott fight was presented as a championship fight, but in reality, it was an insult to the #1 division in boxing. Joe Louis certainly had the right to voice his displeasure, but there was one important nuance. Louis was a true super heavyweight, and he is considerably bigger than Charles. Remember I said that a super heavyweight had to be over 79.4. Well, Charles had a problem with that. At times he'd reduce his workload during camp by not sparring, because his weight was dropping below 80 pounds. If at the official weigh-in he stood on the scale and the scale showed exactly 79, he would not be allowed to fight. Whether he put something in his shorts or drank more water before the weigh-in, or maybe he did both, remains a mystery. In some fights, Ezzard didn't look like the weight he showed at the weigh-in. The fact that Charles is not even close to being a super weight was obvious when Ezzard crossed paths with another legendary boxer, Sugar Ray Robbins. On the left, in the photo, is the welterweight champion. On the right is the super heavyweight champion. By today's standards, that's a difference of 6 weight classes and almost 20 pounds. Ezzard would have been happy to fight at welterweight or even middleweight, but no one would let him do that. Fate took him to the super heavyweight division. He submitted and got what he wanted there. Here, a boxer of his talent didn't care where. Just give him a And now, Ezzard wasn't going to give up the glory of being a champion in the King's division and the money that came with it. His opponents and more had brought him here. If they didn't like something, it wasn't his problem. They had ignored him for years, and now they expected him to have to put his health on the line. He's already wasted a lot of health by facing the most dangerous opponents of his time multiple times. To expect a boxer who could fight at middleweight without much trouble to fight opponents who vastly outweighed him in size and mass was foolish. Nevertheless, the barrage of criticism did hit Charles. A few days later, at the official presentation of the championship belt, one of the reporters asked Ezzard, "What is it like?" "I was more excited when I won the Golden Gloves. I don't feel like a champion because people talk about other boxers. When I beat them all, then maybe I'll feel different." Still, Charles wasn't criticized everywhere. He came back a hero. 17 years ago in the streets of this city, like this on the car drove the champion Keith Chocolate, thereby inspiring a boy to boxing who realized a dream, and now he himself was driven on the car in the status of world champion in the most popular and prestigious weight category. Charles was driven by a woman. At some point, she got confused and ran over 3 spectators, among whom was the sheriff of the city. A little later, the sheriff sued Ezzard for $24,000 in damages. The court dismissed the complaint because Charles was not driving the car. The first defense took place just 49 days after winning the championship title. This is a record in the history of the super heavyweight division. It is the shortest time between winning the title and the first. Charles' opponent was, you have no idea who. Gus, a former bantamweight champion who had been running from Charles for years. Ezzard wasn't happy. Why should he give this man a chance if Lesniewicz didn't see Charles as a real contender until a few years ago? But Charles's displeasure had another reason, a story that is rarely remembered, because it cast a shadow on the careers of several boxers, including, of course, Lesniewicz. In November 1947, a bout took place between Raging Bull Jimmy LaMotta and a very mediocre boxer named Billy Fox. To the surprise of the public and the boxing community, LaMotta lost the fight in the 4th round by knockout. LaMotta's loss looked very questionable. Jake was called in for questioning on suspicion of a contract fight. He stated that shortly before the fight, he had a spleen ailment, but he hid it from the commission because he didn't want to disrupt the fight. The commission believed him. The others didn't. It's a bit too graphic a surrender. 13 years after that fight, LaMotta, who had already finished his career, admitted that he gave up. He received a bribe from Blinky Palermo associate Frankie Carbo. This is video from a 1960 meeting in a case involving the organization of contract fights. The main defendants are Frankie Carbo and Blinky Palermo. One of the main witnesses was the former middleweight champion of the world, Jake LaMotta. I received an offer of $100,000 to lose a boxing fight, and I turned it down. I said I was only interested in championship fights. I was told it could be arranged. A championship fight can be made. I heard while I was training, I got injured. I went to the doctor to have it checked out. It turned out I had a problem with my spleen, and he said I couldn't fight, but I said I would still fight. But eventually I realized I couldn't win the fight, so I told him I was going to lose to Billy Fox if I was guaranteed a world title fight. By the way, one of those who had contact with Blinky Palermo was Sugar Ray Robinson. Ray tried his best to avoid such contact, but in those years, it was impossible to do so. And related to this is the very strange story of Robinson's confrontation against Jake LaMotta. He got a call from Frankie Carbo. He wanted to arrange for Ray to have 2 fights with LaMotta, each with 1 win, and then they would meet a 3rd time. The official story is that Ray Robinson refused. But if we look at his confrontation with LaMotta, we see a rather interesting development in the event. In the first fight, Robinson won in a rather dominant style, playing like a skillful matador with a bull. But in the second fight, for some reason, Ray started to chop, and losing the fight, he didn't change his strategy and continued to fight in a way that suited LaMotta. And in the 8th round, he flew off the ropes and eventually lost by split decision. In the third fight, Robinson, although he was knocked down, won the fight by decision, essentially defeating LaMotta again. You have to admit it's a strange situation when a boxer first crushes his opponent, then loses to him, and then crushes him again. After some time, Robinson and LaMotta met for the fourth. Out of 10 rounds, LaMotta won only one. The boxers then meet for the 5th time. Robinson confidently conducts the beginning of the fight, reduces the pace in the middle, and the last 3 rounds just running from LaMotta, for what the audience began booing. In the end, the judges give Robinson the win by split decision, given that LaMotta's career was handled by Carbo, who had been in contact with Robinson. The whole situation is very interestingly overlaid by this comment. We know directly from Robinson that many times representatives of the mafia contacted him and said, "We don't want you to give up the fight. Just be careful with such and such opponent. Spend all the rounds with him without getting knocked out. We want to bet that the fight will go the full distance." In the second half of the 5th fight, Ray Robinson did everything to make the fight go the whole distance, and Ray achieved an early victory over Raging Bull in the 6th fight, which was dubbed the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. But back to LaMotta and Billy Fox, who Jake lost to on purpose. Guess who Billy Fox went to thanks to his purchased victory over LaMotta? That's right, Gus Lesnovich, who owned the weight belt at the time, and the #1 contender was Ezzard Charles. Lesnovich knocked Fox out in the 1st round, and that was their second meeting. The first was the year before. Gus beat Fox by knockout in the 10th round, and that was Lesnovich's only title fight in 1947. At the end of that year, he was named Boxer of the Year, although at least 3 boxers that year did more than Gus. That's why Charles was so outraged at being forced to fight Lesnovich. He himself was not allowed to fight for the title, while Lesnovich, the holder of the title, was fighting a challenger who became such due to a bought fight. Nobody knew that for sure at the time, but based on the way LaMotta surrendered already, then everyone was sure that he gave up the fight. But since Charles had a contract with IBC and the same office was dealing with Lesnovich, he had to submit. Meanwhile, the press continued to attack Charles, accusing him of being punchless and not fit to be a champion at all, to which Charles replied, "Maybe they are right. I'm not going to argue with them. Let my record speak for me. I'm not Joe Louis. There's only one Joe Louis. Just because the press has seen a few of my fights where I didn't look sensational, it doesn't mean I don't have the right to be considered a champion. It would be beautiful if Charles literally punished Lesnovich for blatantly ignoring for so many years, and Charles did just that. In this fight, he clearly showed why Lesnovich was avoiding the encounter. After 7 rounds, Lesnovich's face turned into a bloody mess, and his team withdrew him from the fight, which was the last of his career. Lesnovich's retirement was not counted by the press. Instead, the press wrote that the boxer nicknamed Cobra from Cincinnati was simply the best of the worst, and there was no new Joe Louis, so Ezzard's promoters decided to send him to Calif to fight popular local boxer Pete Valentino. He was ranked number 8. Nearly 20,000 spectators gathered at the arena, and ticket sales brought in $158,000. Charles's fee was $43,000. The average price of a 3-bedroom house was about $8,000 at the time. The average price of a Ford automobile was about $1,800. When Charles entered the ring before the fight, the local crowd booed him. Moreover, the champion entered the ring first, and not second, as it is supposed to be according to the protocol, and he was announced first too. The fight against Valentino was his 5th fight in 8 months, and Charles didn't look as bright as he did against Lesnovich. He was letting Valentino get to a comfortable close range. That gave Valentino some chances, but Charles was better at close range than Bernard Hopkins. Therefore, in the end, the challenger did not achieve great success. When Valentino was already noticeably tired, Charles decided that it was time to finally respond to the Californian audience that had received him so badly. In the 8th round, he put the local hero to rest with a 2-punch combination. The knockout came in handy because on the scorecards of 2 California judges, Ezzard was losing the fight. Although in that fight, out of 7 full rounds, he lost at best 2. After the fight, Ezzard learned that his managers from Cincinnati, the same ones who had already done nothing but wanted to receive a percentage of the fee, sued him. The size of the lawsuit, $43,000, just the fee in the fight with Valentino. Jake Means turned to Tom Tenos, who helped Means in a number of business matters, and Tens agreed to pay 3 Cincinnati managers $60,000 compensation to give up their stake in Ezzard Charles' career. In the middle of the tourney, Charles injured his hand, and the remaining fights had to be canceled. While Ezzard was recovering December 30th, 1949, he married Gladys. Ezzard preferred to keep the wedding a closely guarded secret. It was his private life, and he did not want anyone to discuss it. At the same time, after the wedding, Ezzard continued to live with his grandmother. Gladys lived with her parents. Charles was more comfortable that way in terms of concentrating on his career. Gladys accepted it, all the more financial provision of his wife and her parents. Charles took on himself. By the way, Ezzard's mother by then returned from New York because she no longer had to work hard. She was now provided for by her son, Ezzard Charles, the Boxer of the Year. Ezzard's next opponent was number 9, Frey Escher. The fight with him was postponed several times for various reasons, and it is not so important for the overall story. The main thing is that while Ezzard was preparing for the fight with Bescher, backstage information began to spread that the former world champion in super heavyweight Joe Louis is preparing to return to the ring. The last time he fought was a year and a half ago, in mid-1948. However, since then, he has been active in exhibition fights. Moreover, in 1949, he met Elber Ray 3 times because Ray never managed to meet Luis in an official fight. So he tried to show his superiority in the exhibition fights. In the end, in the 3rd fight, it all ended with Luis knocking out Ray. A little over a year ago, Ray was the first challenger for the title. Luis regularly won his showcase fights by knockout. One of his opponents was even sent to the hospital. Boxer then paid for his treatment, so that the sports form of the former champion maintained. In addition, in December 1949, Louis held an exhibition fight against Peto Valentino, with whom 2 months before Charles fought. Louis won the fight and knocked out Valentino in the 8th round. This is what Valentino looked like flying off the ropes. You can't tell from his face that he was taking part in a showcase fight, more like a showcase beating. Louis' overly serious attitude towards exhibition fights was noticeable to the point that his next opponent, top 10 contender Lee Oma, refused to fight Louis. Louis denied a comeback, but when he did, the work for his return was already well underway. In fact, leaving boxing wasn't really quitting in its entirety. Joe wanted to fight, and as he admitted later, he felt out of place when he watched the Charles Walcott fight because the boxers were playing for his title. That's because it had already come to light that the IBC paid Joe Louis $150,000 to step aside for a while, then come back and face the new champion. It was July 1950. Louis wanted the fight in December. The head of the IBC, Jim Norris, insisted on a fight in September. First of all, there was already money on the table from radio and television. Nobody wanted to wait until December. Secondly, it was more profitable for the company to have Joe Louis win. It would put the boxing world upside down. The departed champion is bored with retirement, and now he's back in the ring to reclaim what is rightfully his, to get back what he never lost in a fight. You gotta admit, it's a beautiful thing. Pretend you're out of boxing and come back at the right time and make a lot of noise. That wasn't Floyd Mayweather's idea. It was invented a long time ago, back in the days of Jack Dempsey and Tex Rickard. Everyone else was just copying the working scheme. Moreover, no boxer in the history of super heavyweight boxing, after losing a title, has ever been able to get it back. If Joe Louis does it, he will be the first. Therefore, there were only upsides to a Louis victory. The fight scheduled for September was not convenient for Louis, but it was even more inconvenient for Charles. The fight with Louis was scheduled for September 27th, and the fight with Freddie Bashir Charles was to hold on August 15th. So after the fight with Becher, Charles has no time to rest, and only 6 weeks to prepare for the fight against Louis. When Ezzard went up against Bashir, Luis was already in training camp getting ready to fight Charles. Ezzard did everything he could to avoid getting hurt in the fight with Bashir. He boxed incredibly carefully, keeping his opponent away from him so that he would not give him a heavy blow, a cut, or any other injury. But this cautious manner led to the fact that Charles had to spend 14 rounds in the ring. The fight was stopped 7 seconds before the end of the penultimate round. At the time of the stoppage, Charles was leading by a huge margin on points. After Charles defeated Bashir, Ezzard and Louis signed a contract. For the first time in the history of the super heavyweight division, the challenger received more than the champion. Louis' fee amounted to $100,000. Charles received $57,000. The press habitually tore Ezzard apart and predicted that with such a boxing against Joe Louis, he will not last long. Such articles liked everyone. The public was ecstatic about the news of the return of the hero, and if the experts predicted him to win, it's great. On the background of the hero, Louis Charles's chances looked ghostly, but it was obvious. The greatest super heavyweight in history, even if a little slowed down, would fight a welterweight who was still able to fit into the middleweight range. The press that predicted Louis to win was joined by boxers from different eras. Joe Louis will need 2 rounds to warm up, and then another 2 rounds to knock out Charles. If the greatest boxer in history isn't Jack Dempsey, then it's Joe Louis. There is no reason at all to believe he hasn't retained his skill and power. Ezzard Charles is the most underrated boxer I know. Ezzard's chances seem very good to me, but it would be a betrayal to pick anyone other than Joe Louis as the winner. Such comments even irritated a little bit Charles, always quiet and unwilling to make loud comments. So Ezzard decided to play a little with the press, and at the same time to show that he is not a fool and understands well. This fight is made only for one purpose, so that Joe Louis again became champion. The more the New York State Athletic Commission and Ring Magazine, which up to this point did not recognize Charles, as champion, announced that they put their belts at the end of the fight, Charles, Louis. So now it is not just a fight for the title of NBA World Champion. Now it is a fight for the title of Absolute World Champion. And that champion has to be Joe Louis. I'm planning on fighting Joe. I'm not afraid of him. I can probably outbox him if I want to. But to be honest, I haven't decided what the best thing to do is. I was given the title on loan, and now they want to take it away. So I have to knock Louis out to show him that they can't do that to me. They just laughed at those words. This cocky guy is also talking about what style he would use to beat Joe Louis. Ezzard's team had a very interesting reinforcement that played against him from a statistical point of view. Ray Arson, a future member of the Hall of Fame, was brought in as another trainer. However, Arcel did not have a very good reputation because he had worked with many boxers who had lost to Joe Louis. As a trainer, Arcel had not beaten Louis once before one of the fights. When he saw Arcel, not for the first time, Louis said, "You again?" Because Arcel's boxers were losing to Louis one after another. Ray was nicknamed the Meat Wagon, meaning he's like a big meat wagon to Joe Louis. It's an insulting nickname, but Ezzard didn't think he was meat. He had a man in his camp who had studied Joe for years, and right now, that's what he needed. The final prediction of the fight from Louis himself was this: Charles is a good guy, but I believe that with my experience, I will get to him and knock him out. If anyone had any doubts about Joe Louis' victory, they fell away after these words, and after the report that the medical examination of the Athletic Commission showed that Louis' form is better than in his last fight against Jersey Joe Volcat, whom Louis knocked out. The Yankee Stadium arena was packed with 22,000 spectators. Total revenue from the fight, tickets plus TV and radio rights, amounted to $350,000. In the front rows were many celebrities from the world of sports, movies, and music industry, including Frank Sinatra, one of the main fans of Joe Louis. With all due respect to Frank, and how he in the 70s helped Joe Louis with money before the fight, Sinatra weighed himself not in the most pleasant way. He didn't like Charles' style. Frank came up with a joke. Every time journalists saw him with a new girlfriend and asked to introduce her, he replied, "This is Ezzard Charles." Ezzard himself, such things did not get out of balance. Coming into the fight of his life, he was incredibly calm and confident enough that after the start, he broke into close range and attacked his opponent's body, and then added a right on the way out. Logically, Charles should have stayed away from Louis, but at times he stayed as close to his opponent as possible. Ezzard attacked the body and broke the distance with a punch, and at close range at that. It wasn't Bernard Hopkins-style dirty fiddling. It was just amazingly clean work. If you take the quality of work at close range, then compared to Charles Hopkins, looks not a professor, but a student one course. Joe Louis's target was right in front of him at a comfortable distance, because Joe worked very well with hooks. They were the biggest danger. Ezzard was constantly working the body, making his head elusive. In this fight, the scoring system was different than it is today. The winner of a round received 1 point. The loser received 0. In the case of a knockdown, no additional points were deducted from the boxer. Not to say that Louis lost in speed. His right for a boxer, with a weight of almost 100 kilo, flew out very quickly. The difference in size was even a little shocking. Louis showed on the scales 99 kilos. Charles, 15 kilos less, 84 kilos. But looking at the boxers in the ring, feeling that the difference between them at least 20 kilograms, as if super heavyweight fights with an average weight, although in fact it was. Ezzard could still fit into the middleweight category, and for this fight, he was struggling to make weight so as not to be too light. Third round, Charles continues to periodically work at a comfortable distance for Louis. Joe sees the target, but the punches most often fly centimeters from the head. Charles showing just lightning quick reactions. In today's times, 3 rounds is a quarter of the fight, but back then, it was only 1/5 of the fight. Louis was more or less effective with his jab. Ezzard had a problem. After the clash of heads, he had a small hematoma above his left eye. It was not growing fast yet, but Louis's heavy jab could speed up the process. The reigning champion was not only good on offense, but also on defense. One could say that the defense is in the style of Floyd Mayweather or James Toney, but neither of them has yet to emerge. The former champion could now draw some conclusions about his opponent, and the most important conclusion is that Charles hits harder than everyone thinks. One of Louis' trainers warned Joe before the fight not to believe the articles in the press that Charles has no punch at all. He doesn't have enough power to take his opponent down with one punch, but enough to make his opponent wary of flying forward through his punches. On top of that, Charles was very good at punching to the body. He did it regularly in this fight. Charles was a perfect boxer in this fight. What he did was amazing, blocking his jab with his right hand, and then his jab into the target. At the same time, another right hand under his opponent's jab, and an instant right attack. After that, a little stalling with a counterattack. Louis stands up and throws a head. Charles lands a short left hook, goes backwards, closing with a Philadelphia sink, and blocks his opponent's jab. A total of 9 defensive and attacking actions in 2 seconds. The speed of thought is phenomenal, in the dry balance of 4 accurate punches and not one missed punch. And all this while standing right in front of an opponent who is much bigger and can take you down with one punch. Missed jab, but a second jab by Ezzard counterattacks with a punch through the arm, then a close left lateral and an uppercut. After the 5th round, Louis, like Charles, began to swim in his left eye. Ezzard's right hand was doing its job, regularly flew into the target. At halftime, Ray Robinson came to Joe Louis' corner. "Joe, work the jab. You've got to get him off balance." The only problem was that Charles regularly counterattacked Louis's jab, and Joe had to think carefully before throwing the jab. Louis tried to pick up the pace, but Charles was making Louis miss. It was amazing how calm, relaxed, and confident he looked against someone who had held the division in awe for 12 years. Ray Arson, who repeatedly brought boxers out to fight against Louis, had seen his opponents have panic attacks in the locker room before the fight with Joe. Charles was absolutely calm, as if it was not one of the biggest and most important fights in the history of boxing. And the opponent is not the best super heavyweight in the history of boxing. By now, round 9 was the most defeated round of the fight for Louis. And in Detroit, his mom turned off the TV because she couldn't watch it anymore. Charles was just bullying his opponent. Although from a boxing aesthetic point of view, he did it very nicely. But Joe Louis didn't rule the super heavyweight division for nothing. He had some fight wins too. In the 10th round, he suddenly picked up the pace. Of course, to a greater extent, Louis gave the impression that he was bothering his opponent, rather than actually doing it, because it was impossible to get Ezzard with a really heavy punch. But still, the intrigue in the fight revived. The more Charles's nose was bleeding, although in order to break the opponent's nose, Louis had to hit well enough only one time. The judges gave the 10th round to Louis, but I give it to Charles because I am not in favor of the practice of giving a round to a boxer just because he lost it not as clearly as before. Louis brought emotion to the fight and showed that it's too early to write him off, but you don't give rounds away for that. The only thing that really bothered Charles was Louis's jab. Joe's front hand was almost as fast as in past years, although Charles eventually adjusted to the jab and often counterattacked him. In the 11th round, already both boxers had their left eye closed. Louis, who was down in the 12th round, suddenly came alive in the 13th. Good work by the ex-champion, but lacked precision. Clean punches were there, but incomparably few compared to how accurate Charles was hitting. Look how mockingly easy Charles works in the 14th round. He jerked his opponent with his body movement, hit a double jab, then jerked again, and hit a front hand uppercut, and even managed to set up his right hand, blocking Louis's jab. The great bomber had never been bullied like that by anyone. He only had one loss to Max Schmeling. But then it was the up-and-coming and not-so-experienced Joe Louis. But even in that fight, he was winning rounds. It was a competitive fight. This was a total rout. What Charles did against Louis is the best representation of why. Ezzard is nicknamed the Cobra of Cincinnati. He was like a cobra with his precise, lightning-fast attacks. In the history of boxing, there are only a handful of boxers who could work so precisely and devastatingly from any distance. In the final round, Charles did not give his opponent a single chance for which he could latch on. But a battered, tired, and discouraged Louis was hardly capable of any kind of breakthrough. The score of the fight is on your screens. But as for the official score, things are more interesting here. One of the judges gave Joe Louis 2 rounds, another gave him 3, and one gave him 5. Such a count suggests that if the fight had been competitive, Ezzard Charles would have parted with the title. But his advantage was so huge that the judges were powerless. If you ever wondered what it would be like if you put Roy Jones, Bernard Hopkins, and James Toney together, that's the answer you just got. If you combine this trio into one boxer, you get Ezzard Charles in a fight against Joe Louis. Here was everything a boxer has to offer: intelligence, speed, reaction, light on his feet, effective work at any distance, excellent defense. There was no knockout, you might say. Yeah, but Charles is a welterweight. And look at Louis' face after the fight. I'm the real champion now. It's a relief to be the undisputed champion and not have to read all the slander about my title or hear, souvenir champion. Charles thought he had finally gotten some recognition. How very wrong he was. In fact, he had become the anti-hero of the nation. Everyone wanted Joe Louis to be champion again. He was an era of big fights, including after the end of World War II. For many, he was the epitome of victory and peaceful life after the war, a symbol of order and stability. And of course, Joe gave the public dozens of knockouts. Given all this, people had sentimental feelings for him. No one hid that he was eager for his victory. Even journalists, who should be impartial. Louis was too big and iconic a figure to remain neutral. And I guess you can understand all these people. They were like kids who found out that their favorite cartoon series that they had been watching for over 10 years was coming to an end. But suddenly they're told that there's going to be another season. However, the first episode of this season overshadowed all the joy of the continuation. Everything comes to an end, but it is very difficult for people to let go of something that has been with them for many years. For his performance, and it was a truly legendary performance, one of the best in the performance of the boxer in history. Ezzard Charles did not receive much praise. Yes, now he was recognized as the overall champion. He was recognized by every organization. But only those organizations put all the belts on the line because they thought Joe Louis would win. Nobody wanted to give those titles to Charles, but Ezzard snatched them. Even so, people simply refused to accept that the new champion was that good. So they rushed to find excuses for Louis's defeat. The main argument was that Louis hadn't fought in 2 years and had a great career under his belt. But for some reason, the arguments only went one way. What about other arguments? Louis had exhibition fights during the break. Some of them weren't exhibition fights. And some of them were Joe beating recent title challengers. So he had some decent competitive practice. You've already seen the photo of Pedro Valentino after the exhibition fight with Louis. Louis started preparing for the fight before Charles. Charles had a 14-round title fight 6 weeks before meeting Louis. At the time of fighting each other, Louis has 59 fights and Charles has 72 fights. Charles is officially 15 pounds lighter than Louis. After Charles, Louis won 8 fights and became the mandatory title challenger. Joe is older. You can't argue with that. But Charles had many times more heavy fights because he fought 3 divisions. And specifically in the welterweights, the competition was more than in the heavyweight division. There were more elite fighters there. Ezzard had been a title contender as early as 1942. He could have been with the champion with 15-20 defenses, but nobody let him near the title. And why nobody says that in the fight against Louis, it was not the best Ezzard Charles. He was in a slump. I can't even imagine what a better Ezzard Charles would have done to Louis. And it would be okay if the fight was competitive and Charles would have won with great difficulty. But no, he just declassified one of the best super heavyweights in history, even though Ezzard himself had factors not in his favor. Oh, and besides, everyone knew very well that Charles was just presented on a plate for Joe to knock him out. Everything possible had been done for that to happen. But all this was shattered by the fantastic talent and courage of one unstoppable heavyweight nicknamed Cobra from Cincinnati. The fight against Louis was without exaggeration one of the greatest classes in boxing history. A triumph of talent and skill against one of the most intimidating boxers in history, who still holds the record for the number of defenses of the heavyweight title. Indeed, no one at any other weight has ever defended the belt 26 times in a row. Logic often runs up against an impenetrable wall of emotion, and this was one of those times. A little boy from Cincinnati was rejoicing in his success, and he'd say, "Look, I made it, no matter what, even though everybody said I couldn't." But people turned their backs on him. Another Charles, Charles Sonny Liston, would go through a similar story, but he had a prison sentence and direct ties to people in the underworld. There was a lot to hang on to, although the press at one point just made a mockery of Sonny. Ezzard was an angel compared to Liston, even in his hometown of Cincinnati, where he was hailed as a hero after winning an NBA title. He was uncomfortable. Kids on the street booed him and looked at him with disapproval. He beat their hero. How dare he do that? Years later, a journalist would say, when Ezzard Charles had his hand raised as the winner of that fight, it would have been tantamount to being listed as one of America's 10 most wanted criminals. In early December 1950, Charles's opponent is a boxer from the top 10 of the heavyweight division, Nick Barome. The fight took place in Cincinnati at the Garden Arena. In the hall gathered 10,000 spectators out of a possible 12. This fight was chosen as an unloading, and Barone was not expected to give a surprise. And so, it turned out. The victory of the champion by knockout in the 11th round. At the end of 1950, for the second year in a row, Charles was recognized as Boxer of the Year. January 12, 1951, Ezzard defeated number 8, ranked Leo Mu. And although Charles' fights often collected a good box office, it was far from those indicators that were inherent in the super heavyweight. IBC decides to organize a rematch with Jersey Joe Volcat, while Charles was preparing for his second fight with Volcat. Joe Louis was preparing for his second fight with Ezzard himself. Joe began with some verbal attacks. I believe Charles is no better than the champions I have faced in the past. I'll put him at number 6 on the list of my top opponents behind Billy Conn, Max Barr, James Braden, Max Schelling, and Tommy Farr. There's only one thing to say here. Imagine the height Charles was at. He ended up not only defeating his childhood hero, but had him belittling the accomplishments of Ezzard himself. In the past, Joe Louis had gone through a similar situation himself. When he lost to Max Schmeling, kids teased him in the street, running up and whispering to him. Max Schmeling. Just yesterday, Joe was a hero, and now he was being teased on the street. He must have realized how it was when the public turned their backs on him, but his great ego was very hurt after such a debacle and demanded retribution. Even if you were once in that position yourself, your opponent's problems are your advantage. That's the business. If your opponent has a weakness, you have to hit them. Louis did. But for now, it was too early for Ezzard to think about Louis, because in preparation for the fight with Volcat, there was a problem. It was his third fight in 4 months. Ezzard was on such a schedule that he just didn't have time to rest and recover. And let me remind you, he's already got 75 fights under his belt. His weight started to drop. He had to stop sparring because his weight dropped to 80 kilos. 1 more pound down, and he wouldn't be allowed to fight. And Ezzard didn't want to be too light. He needed to gain some muscle mass so that he wouldn't get beaten up. The second fight with Volcat took place in Detroit, where Joe Louis lived. He showed up for the fight. This further energized the crowd, who greeted Volcat with applause, while champion Charles was met with a disapproving roar. Ezzard found himself in hostile territory, in not the best shape, against a very uncomfortable opponent, but he had no choice. His fights weren't bringing in the revenue he wanted, so the promoters were going for quantity. The fight got off to a quiet start, but in round 4, Walcott caught Ezzard with a right jab. The champion had to hang on to his opponent for a doggo to recover, but soon Jersey Joe shook Charles again, and the championship hung in the balance. The crowd was ecstatic. At last, this useless champion would be dethroned. But it was already the 9th round. After trouble in 4, Charles turned on the cautious mode and took control of the fight. In 9, he took advantage of his opponent's overconfidence and sent him to the canvas. This forced Walcott into cautious mode. And Ezzard Charles had no competitors in the cautious fights. And even though Walcott was able to shake Ezzard in the 14th round, The victory went to the champion by unanimous decision. The audience, as before the fight, booed Charles again. Booing doesn't bother me. I'm used to this reaction when I fight. On the one hand, it's good that it doesn't bother you, but it just wasn't a fair attitude in general. And you can't say that Ezzard Charles' fights were boring. He was dominating, showing very beautiful boxing. He was winning by knockout. And the knockdown in the second fight with Walcott is one of the most beautiful in the history of boxing. But that only served to turn the public against him. The longer Charles remained champion, the more wanted him to lose. That's the situation the champion found himself in. The whole boxing public wants him to lose. But he, through sweat, blood, and incredible willpower, continues to win and fight, and in the division to which he does not reach in terms of weight. Immediately after his win over Walcott, Charles's manager Jake Means returned to talks about a Joe Louis rematch. The parties had previously communicated and did not agree on finances. The situation was as follows. The organizers took 40% of the income from the second fight between Charles and Louis, and the boxers shared the remaining 60%. Louis wanted 40% for himself and 20% for Charles. Means did not argue with the fact that Louis is a big figure, but the champion, Charles, and the last fight he won, defeated. So Ezzard's manager thought an equal split was fair. That is, each boxer will receive 30% of the total revenues. Louis said that he would not concede a percent. At the same time, Joe refused to include in the contract a rematch clause in case of his victory. Means perfectly understood that he and Charles are already as a bone in the throat of big promoters. And if you do not protect their interests, you can stay without a title. The saddest thing about this story is that Ezzard Charles is already on the decline. Despite being only 30 years old, he already has 77 fights. Ezzard started his career 11 years ago, minus 3 years in the Army. That's 8 years of active duty. So he's been on a pace of 7 to 8 fights a year for a long time. Can you imagine champions in modern boxing fighting at that pace? And back then, there was no such good pharmacological support as there is now. There were no specialists in nutrition and physical training. Everybody's got different strength reserves. But the problem is that Ezzard spent most of his career fighting bigger opponents. He moved up to super heavyweight. Means had no illusions. He knew they didn't have long to stay on top, especially since IBC had cornered the champion like a horse. He wanted to make as much money as he could and not let Ezzard take the title away from him and throw it away as a waste of time. Louis was adamant, only 40%, and if he won, he wouldn't give Charles a rematch. Negotiations were put on pause again. Then IBC decided to let Charles fight again with Joey Maximum, whom they had already met 3 times. There was no competition in the first 2 fights, but in the third fight, Maxim gave Ezzard trouble, and to top it off, Joey was now the weight champion. The 2 Ohio champions will meet in another bout. Charles defeated Maxim without much trouble, showing who really is the best weight in the world. But Maxim's title was not at stake, so the satisfaction was only moral. Cincinnati fans booed Charles before the fight, during the fight, after it. Even some journalists were so surprised by the lack of support for Charles in his home arena that a couple of articles appeared after the fight in his defense. It doesn't matter who they pick as my opponent. The public will always say it's a sack, so there's no way I can look good no matter how hard I try. I have no chance of beating Joe Louis in the eyes of the public. The only way I can beat Louis is in the ring. Charles received $70,000 for the fight against Maxim, and then learned that negotiations with Joe Louis resumed. Joe agreed to terms. But before going out on Louis for the second time, Tom Turnos the same one who paid kickbacks to managers from Cincinnati, signed Charles for 3 fights with Jersey Joe Walcott, and the fight was in 1.5 months, and that was over the top. Ezzard became champion in June 1949. He then went on to defend the title 8 times, Walcott in July 1951, and it was Ezzard's 10th championship fight in 2 years. Charles' trainer Ray Arson was furious. Ezzard was exhausted physically from a busy schedule and mentally from the media pressure and needed time to rest. Walcott was bigger and more powerful than Charles and had a tough time with Jersey Joe in his last fight. Going at him now is a guaranteed loss. Tom Tenos said that Walcott's manager Felix Bocchicchio is his friend and he is tight on money, so the third fight is just a way to help a friend out. Charles's trainer Ray Arcel was well aware that Bocchicchio, one of the most powerful men in the gambling world, didn't need the money, considering that Tenos was also involved in the gambling business. He was probably just in debt to Walcott's manager. And Bocchicchio was the kind of man to whom debts are best repaid on time. And Tenos decided to do it with the help of Ezzard Charles. The problem started right before the fight. The parties agreed on the judges, but when they started announcing the judges, it turned out that one of them had been replaced by another. The agreement was that if there was a replacement, it had to be notified in advance. Jake Means jumped into the ring and made a scandal, and then began to shout to journalists that the fight would not happen because there was a direct breach of contract. Means threw a real tantrum to try and derail the fight. Eventually, Jake was taken out of the ring by police, and a commission representative said that if Charles didn't come out for the fight, he would be stripped of his title. Meanwhile, Ezzard was already sitting in the corner, and something happened to him that had never happened before. He started to get nervous. He knew he wasn't ready for the fight. A small digression must be made here. Despite the fact that Charles had long had his friend Jimmy Brown as a trainer, and then Ray Arcel as an assistant, the plan for the fight had always been Ezzard's own prerogative. And that's how he developed it. Ezzard used visualization. He would close his eyes and try to visualize how to act against a particular opponent, how a particular opponent might act, and how he might respond. What variants of the development of the fight could be, and what could be done in each of the variants. That is, Charles had not only Plan A, but also Plan B, Plan C, etc., alphabetically. But before the third fight with Walcott, Charles couldn't imagine anything at all. His brain refused to produce any picture at all. Ezzard was simply tired, mentally and physically. When the fight began, in the ring was Jersey Joe Volcat against a sparring partner with whom he could do anything he wanted. And in the 7th round, what the crowd was waiting for happened. People weren't happy that Jersey Joe Volcat became champion on 5 attempts. They were happy that finally their unloved champion fell, and couldn't get up. What a pleasant sight. A little while later, Walcott came into Ezzard's locker room. He held out his hand and said, "I'm sorry about that." Charles replied, "It's all right. If you were fighting someone else, I'd be rooting for you." According to the contract, Walcott was obliged to give a rematch to Charles within 3 months. But Walcott's manager Felix Bocchicchio was in no hurry. He sent his boxer on tour and on television and enjoyed the fact that his fighter is the world champion in the super heavyweight division. He also enjoyed the fact that he could now recoup all the money he had invested in him. In addition, Bocchicchio was not sure that Walcott could beat Charles. After all, so far the overall score was in Charles's favor. Instead, Bocchicchio looked to the next title challenger, and that would be Rocky Marciano. Bocchicchio felt that Rocky was stylistically a match for Volcat. Plus, Marciano was gaining popularity and there was a lot more money to be made with him. Walcott himself stated that he wouldn't want to step into the ring for a year even though Jersey Joe's signature was on the contract, which stated that he was obligated to give a rematch within 90 days. I worked for 21 years to become a champion. I promised God that if he made me a champion, I would do something good. That's why I do charity work. I defend my title every day by helping young people. I don't want to defend my title in the ring until a year from now, when you want to hold on to the title as long as possible, and you don't know how to justify saying good intentions. Jersey Joe had a rough road, but after he became champion, his demeanor became repulsive. When he was a challenger, he thought champions were obligated to fight him. And when he became champion himself, he suddenly decided he didn't owe anyone anything. The path to becoming champion is more important and more difficult than any other. Volkat's manager, Felix Bochicchio, said that the champion in the super heavyweight division should fight once a year, because too frequent title defenses cheapen the title. Now it is clear what modern promoters are guided by. Apparently, they're Bochicchio fans. While Charles' management was trying to get a contracted fight, the boxer himself was resting. For 2 months, he could not think about boxing. He bought his mother a house. And on July 1st, he had a third child. Charles ate what he wanted, spent time with friends in the restaurant, entertainment venues. And he didn't have to answer provocative questions from journalists and hear that he was the wrong champion. He was finally able to rest. In the first days of September 1951, he was informed that he had 5 weeks to prepare for a fight against a top 10 boxer named Rex Lane, who had knocked out Rocky Marciano in the previous fight. 5 weeks is not a long time, but Charles was not the kind of boxer who needed a long time to get in shape. 2 months of rest was good for him, and 5 weeks was enough time to get ready. Especially Lane was a straightforward boxer, without good defense. Charles had no trouble dealing with his opponent and won by knockout in the 11th round. Aside from the fight with Walcott, Charles still had a chance to face Joe Louis. The bomber didn't lose interest in Ezzard because he still wanted to answer for his defeat. However, the Charles-Louis II fight was not meant to be. 2 weeks after Ezzard defeated Lane Joe, Louis lost by knockout to Marciano. And after the fight, he announced his retirement from boxing. Now for good. With Louis gone, the only big target left was Walcott, but his manager flatly refused to talk about a Walcott-Charles fight. Ezzard had already faced Joey Maxim for the 5th time to boost his confidence. Who was still the weight champion? If Ezzard had a little more clout, he could have gotten Maxim's belt on the line, but Joey's manager, Jack Kearns, who had worked with Dempsey, would never allow it. Ezzard again defeated Maxim, and again without any controversy, confirming that he has been the strongest weight in the world for about 10 years, who due to circumstances has to fight in another weight. Just 10 days after beating Maxim, Charles had an easy job, a fight against Joe Cahuta, who was once a promising fighter and even ranked in the top 10 of the bantamweight division. But then things went downhill, and Cahoot turned into a middleweight. Nevertheless, he was popular in Portland, and Charles got $10,000 for the fight against him. In those days, you could buy a big house for that kind of money. After 3 fights, Ezzard again took a break, and in the meantime, the long negotiations about the fight with Walcott ended. It happened in the middle of February 1952, but Bochicchio got his way. The fight was scheduled for June. This meant that Walcott still got his year out of the ring as champion. Despite the fact that it was already the 4th meeting, the audience interest was great, which was reflected in the fees of the boxers. Walcott received $103,000, Charles, $92,000. There were almost 22,000 spectators in the arena. Walcott fought well for the first 6 rounds, but that's where his strength ended and he went into energy-saving mode. There was none of his trademark footwork and explosive attacks. He walked around the ring and made it clear that now his task was to catch his opponent with the same powerful punches as last time. Charles was cautious, but still did more work. After the Volcat-Charles fight was over, many in the audience had the feeling that history had been made today, and Ezzard Charles was the first boxer in the history of the super heavyweight division to regain the title after losing it. However, the judges unanimously gave the win to Walcott. What's interesting, before the final round, two judges had a draw on the cards. The last round was unequivocally won by Charles. Ezzard threw more accurate punches and landed more solid punches overall. It was such an obvious round in his favor that the two judges who had a draw gave the final round to Walcott, making him the winner. In those days, there were only two judges, and the role of the third was played by the referee. He also kept score, so that in the end, there were still 3 cards. So the referee of this fight, Zach Clayton, became the first black referee to officiate a super heavyweight title fight. Clayton constantly picked on Charles and ultimately gave the win to Walcott by a score of 9-6. Even the journalists who had been constantly criticizing Charles for a long time stood up for him. It was quite obvious that the sympathy of referee Clayton was on the side of Walcott. He was just hounding Charles. Referee Clayton picked on Charles and unfairly warned him for infractions he did not commit. Virtually all the reporters who attended the fight accused referee Clayton of incompetence. The gift that Jersey Joe received was indefensible. Journalists even gave the victory to Charles, albeit by a small margin of votes, 24-17. But even such a preponderance among those who had recently wished Ezzard defeat spoke volumes about the outcome of the fight. To this, we can add one more interesting point. The favorite 2-1 was Charles, and he remained so until the day of the fight. Until someone on the day of the fight bet very big money on the victory of Walcott. And so much so that the odds changed, and Walcott became the 2-1 favorite. Let me remind you, Volcat's manager was Felix Bocchicchio. He was a big man in the field of gambling and betting. The fight was in the state of Pennsylvania, Bocchio's main area of operation. Don't make excuses for me. They gave the win to Volcat. So be it. I'm just a regular boxer now. I'll never get another chance to fight for the title. I guess I missed my chance tonight. Ezzard was very honest with himself and the public. It's hard to find a boxer who could be more honest. Charles was in agreement with those who gave the win to someone other than him, but he also believed that he had the opportunity to show a little more perseverance and take a little more risk. Volcat was tired, and it was possible to try and push him down. The fact that Ezzard's trainer had long been his friend, who was more of an assistant, played a role here. He was not an authority to Ezzard and could not force him. For years now, Ezzard had been his own coach. He practiced his own technique, built his own strategy, and when recently joined his team, Ray Arcel in the course of the fight insisted that Ezzard risked and tried to bite from the opponent more. Charles did his own way. He didn't want to take the risk of biting off a little at a time. He'd been used to counting on himself for years. As Arcel said a year later, Ezzard Charles is a very good racehorse, but he won't run where you tell him to. He'll run where he thinks he should. It's also believed that Charles left his aggression behind in his fight with Sam Barudi. It was just psychologically very hard for him to get his opponent. Ezzard himself said that this was not the case. After the fight with Volcat, Charles was offered a rematch with Rex Lane, whom he knocked out in October 1951. Before the fight with Lane, Charles had trouble checking into a hotel because the owner said, "I will not allow blacks to stay in my hotel." The place to train was a roller skate court. They put a temporary ring on it and hung bags of disgusting quality. The fight was in Utah, Rex Lane's home state, and the referee chosen was Jack Dempsey, who had been a long-time resident of Utah and was well acquainted with the state's leadership. It would seem that what could go wrong? The sure favorite for the fight was Charles, but on the day of the fight, on the victory of Rex began to make a large number of bets, and the favorite was Lane. Interestingly, the judges were not involved in the fight. The decision on the winner was made only by the referee. Do you know who Jack Dempsey gave the win to? That's right, Rex Lane, who barely made it to the bell. And Dempsey's card was amazing. 7 rounds tied, 2 to Lane and 1 to Charles. The only consolation was that Charles received $45,000 for the fight, 1.5 months after being robbed. For the second time, the super heavyweight division had a new champion who gave the people what they loved Joe Louis for. He was winning by knockout. In the 13th round, losing the fight on all 3 cards, Marciano knocked out Jersey Joe Volcat. For Charles, as he thought it was good news, Volcat will not give him another fight under any circumstances. In fact, the real score of their confrontation was 3-1 in favor of Ezzard. But there was a chance to face Marciano, a ghostly one, but there was a chance. In order to get a fight with Marciano, you had to win, and not just one opponent, but a whole bunch of them. Easy to say, but it's hard to do, especially when you're talking about a boxer with 83 fights on his record. For comparison, Manny Pacquiao had 72 fights in his career. Sugar Ray Leonard, for example, only had 40. Charles started with Bernie Reynolds, who was just recently knocked out by Rocky Marciano. With Reynolds, Ezzard could have won the fight with just his jab. But if he had, the press would have torn him to shreds. It took him 1.5 rounds to finish the fight. His opponent's delayed reaction to the jab only added to the moment. His next opponent was Argentinian Cesar Bryan. He lost twice to Joe Louis. At one point, Bryan was on the verge of making the top 10. Encounters with Louis in 1950 and 1951 took a toll on him. Nevertheless, the victory over Bryan was another small step towards a title fight. Next came victories over an old acquaintance, Bivens, and Tommy Harrison. By the way, the story of Harrison became the basis for the 2007 movie Raising a Champion, in which Sammy Jackson played. Already in his old age, Harrison, being homeless, claimed that his name was Bob Satterfield, and Satterfield is one of the greatest knockout artists in boxing history. He's actually a very popular boxer in the 40s and 50s. Harrison, at one point in the ratings, was even higher than Satterfield, and the plot of the movie, Resurrecting the Champion, just and is tied on how a homeless former boxer who met Charles, Floyd Patterson, was in the top 10 heavyweights, and he had something to brag about, still pretended to be another boxer. After Harrison, Charles faced Rex Lane for the 3rd time. In a fight, he was recently robbed by Jack Dempsey. Lane was on the floor 3 times and couldn't be pulled out by his ears even if he wanted to. The victory was celebrated by Charles. In May 1953, Ezzard faced Larry Watson, and right before the fight, Rocky Marciano entered the ring. Unfortunately, there are fragments of the fight. It was a spectacular fight. Charles won by knockout in the 5th round, and the crowd traditionally booed him. It's become a habit. Since Charles defeated Joe Louis in all the following fights, even if Ezzard as a hurricane demolished his opponent, the audience still reacted with disapproving roars. Even Marciano came to Ezzard's defense, saying he didn't understand the crowd's reaction. Rocky himself came to the fight 11 days after he defeated Joe Volcata Jersey in a rematch. Their second fight took place as much as 8 months after the first. Volcat's side didn't agree to any terms at all, even when Jersey Joe was offered $250,000, which at the time was a lot of money. Marciano, already a champion, was only supposed to get $160,000. But Bocchio and Volcat started to say that it wasn't enough. The situation was solved by Frankie Carbo. He called Bocchio directly and said that if they didn't take the fight, bad things could happen. Now Volcat gladly accepted the fight and fell in the 1st round. Jersey Joe sat until the ref said 10. And when the ref stopped the fight, Volcat stood up and accused the ref of counting too fast. As we can see, the referee counted perfectly. But there is another version of events. Given the call from Frankie Carbo, Volcat was warned that he should not win the rematch. So Jersey Joe just walked out and gave up the fight. And to save face, he blamed the referee for his defeat. Anyway, Jersey Joe Walcott made an even bigger mess of himself. He won and defended the title in 2 fights with Charles, and in both cases, not without manipulation behind the scenes. He stayed away from a rematch with Marciano for a long time. Then, still came out, fell in the first round, and it looked like Joe just went out for a check, and his fee was much more than the champion. By the summer of 1953, Charles was on a streak of 9 wins in 7 months. With that, he had climbed to the top of the rankings. And since Marciano came to fight, Charles was expected to make a defense against the #1 ranked fighter. However, Rocky's team chose Roland La Starza as his opponent. Marciano and La Starza had already met 3 years earlier in March 1950. And at that time, the official judges called it a draw. However, an additional judge ruled the fight in favor of Rocky, and on this basis, the victory was given to him. That fight caused a lot of controversy regarding the decision of the additional judge, because he gave the victory to Rocky with an advantage of as much as 3 points, which looked questionable. But questionable fights have been a part of Marciano's career, especially since he was managed by Frankie Carbo. He was one of the most influential criminal masterminds in the United States in the 40s and 50s. After Charles found out that all his work had been for nothing, and the title fight was rated #3, he went home, and even started to think about ending his career. The team signed him to fight Cuban Nino Valdez. It was a very strange choice. Valdez was a tall, assertive, very uncomfortable fighter, but he lost 4 of his last 5 fights, including to Archie Moore. Charles and his team took Valdez too lightly, and he put on one of the best fights of his life and won by decision. Not only was Valdez better than Charles expected, but the fight was held in Miami in terrible heat, which wore Ezzard out. And in just 4 weeks, it was necessary to go out to fight against Harold Johnson, whose contract was signed before Valdez. Johnson was 25 years old and already one of the best boxers of his time. He would eventually become the bantamweight champion and enter the Hall of Fame. Instead of just preparing for the Harold fight, Team Ezzard decided to make an easy $6 grand for the Valdez fight. And that $6 grand cost them too much. Johnson is a well-trained, physically strong, and hungry for big wins as a fighter. He's 7 years younger than Charles, and he's fought half as many fights. This is not the kind of opponent you want to come out to a month after a grueling fight. Johnson had one of the best jabs you've ever seen. And with that jab, Harold immediately began to stress his opponent. This fight as a counter-argument to a rather popular viewpoint, like what boxing was like in the mid-20th century. Modern fighters would have scattered those guys from the past like rookies. Looking at the Charles Johnson fight, you'd think that if anyone would have been scattered, it certainly wouldn't have been these 2 guys. And that's 50. And pharma began to be actively introduced into boxing and other sports only in the 60s. Surprisingly, Ezzard Charles performed better than you'd expect. Johnson had the advantage in the first half. A small one though. But in the second half, Charles looked better. The fight was interesting and some of the rounds were difficult to count. Some people thought Johnson won, others thought Charles won. And some people thought it was a draw. The outcome was decided by a very simple thing. The fight took place on Johnson's turf in Pennsylvania, and all 3 judges were from that state. And yet one of them gave Charles a 7-3 victory. But the other 2, 6-3 and 5-4, gave the local fighter the win. After 2 defeats, even if the past was relatively controversial, the fight with Rocky Marciano could be forgotten. Ezzard had a private home in Cincinnati. He owned 2 apartment buildings in the city. He owned a sports club, and some of his money was invested in stocks. If he ended his career now, he'd be making $200 a week doing nothing at all. And at one time, he was getting $200 a fight. If Ezzard Charles had left at that point, it would have been a timely end to his career. A legendary career. 94 fights, 83 wins. A middleweight who became super heavyweight champion of the world and beat Joe Louis. What more could you ask for? But Charles was a born boxer, and while he felt he had the power, he couldn't just walk away. He tried to make another run at a title fight. How? It wasn't clear yet. But maybe there would be a chance. And fate had given him that chance. Jake Means got a call from Yale Weil, Marciano's manager and IBC image maker. He was also one of Frankie Carbo's assistants. Weil said there are no big names left in the super heavyweight division to make a big fight with. There's a boxer named Ezzard Charles, but he's lost 2 fights in a row. We'll made a condition. If Ezzard right now wins 2 fights against top contenders, then he would get the fight with Marciano. Means immediately called Harold Johnson's manager with a rematch offer. He said they weren't interested in a rematch with Charles. That was expected. In the end, Means signed number 9 heavyweight Ali Volas, who Charles knocked out in the 10th round. Half the deal was done, and some members of the press to whom Al Weil had thoughtfully handed out money began to write enthusiastically about Ezzard Charles being back in the championship race. Jake Means attempted a rematch with Nino Valtares. The Cuban refused. For years, Charles has gone after different boxers, but no one has gone after him but one man. He's been mentioned in history before. It was Bob Satterfield, but not the fake one, the real one. One of the most brutal boxers of those years and beyond. Ring magazine would later list Satterfield as one of the 100 greatest knockouts in boxing history. Satterfield beat Harold Johnson, by the way. A little ahead of time, Bob knocked out Clearand Williams, the same Williams who was later knocked out by Santy Liston and Muhammad Ali. Only Bob did it much earlier. He was similar to Charles in that he was also a welterweight, but occasionally fought in the super heavyweight division. Satterfield was just a perfect, spectacular fighter. Crazy power in his fists, but weak chin. And he had been dreaming about a fight against Ezzard Charles for several years. And then Charles himself came to visit him in Chicago, where Bob had spent most of his fights and was a local star. To prepare for the fight against Satterfield were hired powerful sparring partners. Among them was a young super heavyweight who had only had 3 professional fights. The prospect they saw in him was Sonny Liston. Management decided that Sonny would benefit from such experience in sparring with a master like Charles. And here's what Ezzard said years later about those sparring sessions. Liston was big and clumsy, but incredibly tough. In the first round, Satterfield hooked Charles a couple times. It looked very dangerous. However, Ezzard, he's in white shorts, reacted normally and wasn't shaken. And then something very beautiful happened. Using a combination of straight right and left lateral, Charles sent Satterfield to the canvas, from which he would rise only 45 seconds later, not without help. If there was a Knockout of the Year award in those days, this masterpiece would be definitely out of competition. So, after winning 2 fights just a month apart, Ezzard Charles did what seemed impossible in his position. He got a title fight. Rocky Marciano versus Ezzard Charles was scheduled for June 17, 1954. Despite the fact that Charles was only 32 years old, and he was only 2 years older than Marciano, the clear favorite was Rocky. On his account, 45 fights. On the account of Ezzard, 96 fights. Rocky is 5 centimeters shorter, but at the weigh-in, he was 1 kilogram heavier. Marciano was originally in that category. and Charles wasn't a heavyweight at the beginning of his career or now. So there was nothing surprising in the fact that Rocky was the clear favorite and victory to him predicted by all. There was not the slightest hint of enmity between the boxers. On the contrary, they communicated as old friends, and not only in English, but also in Italian.
Okay, sure. ¿Cómo está, campeón del mundo, esta noche?
Molto bene.
¿Qué piensa usted esta sera?
Stasera è tardi per me.
Tardi.
Me.
Anche io, è troppo tardi per me.
Wait a minute.
Both boxers received record fees. Marciano, $275,000, Charles, $138,000. 47,000 tickets sold for $540,000, and the total revenue from radio and television amounted to almost $850,000. The bout became one of the most box office fights in history. Why was it so? First of all, because Marciano was insanely popular. Secondly, because people like to be presented with a confrontation between a hero and an anti-hero. Marciano also defeated Joe Louis by knockout. As always, there are nuances. Charles never had a very powerful man behind him. Marciano had one and more than one. Rocky started building a positive image before he became champion, and Marciano fit the role of good guy because he really was a good guy, and he didn't need to pretend. It was enough to just be himself. Plus, he was truly the white man who broke the 15-year hegemony of the black champions. That was a big factor too, and he was Italian. The influence of the Italian mafia on boxing in those days was huge. Rocky quickly made acquaintances with the most famous people in America. His team arranged for him to appear on TV shows, paid for rave reviews about him. Everything was done to make Rocky a beloved and popular champion. And now, this champion and hero meets the main anti-hero of recent years, Ezzard Charles. Marciano was a money generator, and a win would only enhance his status. Charles' team in the boxing industry aside, everyone in the boxing industry wanted Rocky to win. And that didn't sit well with everyone after a few rounds had gone by. Ezzard Charles, who everyone had written off, was teaching the beloved champion a boxing lesson. The first 5 rounds went to Charles's dictation, but behind was too big career and spent too many hard fights. Charles no longer had any reserve for an active 15-round fight. At 6, he started to save his strength, so Rocky was able to get closer and started to hit. However, the fracture was not abrupt. It was gradual. After 10 rounds, Charles still led in the score, and not only objectively, but even on the judges' scorecards. Nevertheless, the fight was tilted in favor of Marciano. He often missed. There were not many accurate punches. Charles was working better, but in a fight where the overall favorite is constantly coming forward, the judges will count activity, not accurate punches. In rounds 12 and 13, Charles had a very tough time. The crowd was roaring, the knockout was close. He was already clearly asking for it, just a little more. And the Brockton blockbuster would choke out the Cobra from Cincinnati. Charles had already endured more than Joe Louis, Joe Walcott, and other super heavyweights that Rockies had swept out of the ring. In round 14, the Cobra started stinging painfully again. It was amazing how the old worn-out welterweight, as Ezzard was called by the press before the fight, not only refused to give up, but fought to win. In the end, the bout went the full distance. The judges gave the win to Marciano. But if you look at the whole picture of the fight, Ezzard Charles did not lose the fight. Just before the fight, it was clear. In order to win in a 15-round fight against a main star of boxing is not enough to take 15 rounds and hope that you will be given the victory with a score of 8-7. You have to do what you did with Louis, all 15, and then maybe they'll give you 10. Everyone in the boxing community agrees that Ezzard Charles was a big winner in his 15-round fight against Rocky Marciano. It was one of the greatest fights in the heavyweight division. Without belittling the champion, it must be said that Ezzard made this fight happen. Never in modern boxing history has a 15-round super heavyweight championship fight been so dramatic. Every great boxer always has one last fight in store. In Charles' case, this was that fight. For the first time in his life, Ezzard caused a real furor in the press. There was not a single article in which they said about him, "Not that bad." There was no such thing that wrote about him, even something neutral. It was a flurry of cheers. Finally approaching the 100-fight mark, he was recognized. The sad part is that he was recognized only after he was worn out, lost speed, endurance, and his reflexes were no longer the same. And in order to moderate, the opponent had to take all the responsibility, not on the skill, but on the character, which he always had. It is not possible to come from the black ghetto to the title of world champion in super heavyweight without being a super heavyweight without character. It was obvious, but for some reason, a lot of people couldn't see it, but probably didn't want to. It was bad luck for Charles to beat Luis at the most inopportune moment, and only a fight with Marciano could wash that away. And here's what Rocky had to say. "I learned what real pain is when I fought Ezzard Charles." Ezzard received praise, and from Joe Louis, who considered the fight in favor of Charles. Although Joe was still eating up resentment inside for that defeat, Luis had hit Marciano more in under 8 rounds than he had hit Charles in 15 rounds. Nevertheless, Joe stated that he thought Ezzard was the winner. After only one defeat, Charles gained the recognition that 85 wins could not bring him. Moreover, if earlier to get a championship fight, he had to win only, now Ezzard got another chance after the defeat. The rematch took place exactly 3 months after the first fight, September 17th, 1954. Despite all the excitement, interest in the rematch was lower. First of all, the second fight was made too quickly. Radio and television people were not ready to spend a lot of money with such regularity. Here, the organizers were a little bit let down by greed. Secondly, when the emotions after the fight, fans and journalists began to return to reality. And it was this: Charles fought a tough fight, the toughest fight of his life. It's unlikely that in the 3 months between fights, he'll suddenly become younger. Obviously, in such a short period of time, Marciano, who is in the prime of his life, will recover much better. Perhaps that was the reason for organizing the rematch soon, not to give Charles to rest and recover fully. Nevertheless, the rematch still brought impressive revenues. $635,000, $200,000 less than the first fight, but the amount is still impressive for those times. Marciano got $250,000. Charles got $90,000. The first round was relatively quiet, but it was an indicator that the audience will not see another great fight. Rocky Marciano was not facing Ezzard Charles, but his shadow. The reserve, which still remained at Ezzard, he left in the first battle. From the great Charles remained very little, as if for the past 3 months since the first battle, he had aged 5 years. However, when it seemed to be clear everything was already clear, something happened. In the 6th round, by some miracle, Charles literally cut Marciano's nose in half and blood flowed in streams. Journalists became animated and began to loudly say that the fight will now be stopped. Marciano's trainer, Charlie Goldman, expected the same and told his boxer that a knockout was needed because of such an injury, the fight could be stopped at any second. In any other circumstances, the fight would have probably been stopped, but Rocky Marciano was not an easy boxer. His career was managed by Frankie Carbo, and once a witness with an accusation against Carbo fell out of a window under strange circumstances shortly before the fight. If referee Al Berne had taken Marciano out of the fight, he, Burley, would have been drowned in the East River shipping channel. Charles held on as best he could, hoping for a miracle, but there was no miracle. His body began to simply fail. The fight ended with Marciano winning in the 8th round, after which the doctors had to completely seal Rocky's nose. Strangely enough, the second fight was recognized as the fight of the year, although the first was more spectacular. On the other hand, in the second fight, because of the injury, it can be said that Rocky won a willful victory. The press, which initially foresaw such a development, went on the attack against Charles. He was accused of cowardice, that he could have tried to hold out longer. Ezzard tried to defend himself, but it would have been better if he hadn't, because it turned out very badly. He said he managed to get off the canvas before the ref said 10. It was really on the edge there, but even assuming Charles would have been allowed to continue, with all my heart, I'd like to hope that Ezzard had a chance, because he deserved it. But most likely continuing the fight wouldn't have changed anything. Ezzard himself said that he could have lasted a couple more rounds and aggravated Marciano's injuries enough to force the referee to stop the fight. But everyone realized that to do that, Charles needed to get at least a couple of years younger and literally rip Marciano's nose off. In the locker room after the fight, Ezzard asked Means, "When do you think I can fight for the title again?" Jake knew the exact answer to that question: never. But he did say, it may take some time. Charles was back in Cincinnati. After his first fight with Marciano, he'd been greeted like a hero. Now the city was quiet. People on the streets wouldn't even look in my direction. They only approached me if they wanted money. Ezzard wanted to keep fighting and step into the challenger's position. Means didn't believe that, so he began to slowly distance himself. He did not do this because he wanted to leave the boxer. On the contrary, he did it because on his own, Ezzard could not organize fights and would soon end his career. He loved Charles with all his soul and all his heart, and it was painful for him to watch Ezzard lose. In June 1957, Means died of a heart attack. Jake once called Ezzard Charles a schoolboy, and then became his most ardent admirer and defender. And there is a good deal of Means' share in the great achievements Charles has made. As William Wetloff wrote in his book about Ezzard, in the history of boxing, no manager has ever fought for the rights of his boxer as desperately as Jake Means fought for Charles before the third fight with Walcott, when he found out that they were cheated with the judges. And indeed they were. Means took the fall, risking disbarment or even arrest to try to sabotage a fight in which his boxer was going to lose. Jake died when he was only 57 years old. In 1959, Charles had 11 fights, 6 wins, 5 losses. The most striking episode was 2 fights with John Holman, located on the 4th place of the rating in the super heavyweight. Ezzard lost the first fight and won the second. This could have been the jumping-off point for another return to contender status for Ezzard, but it didn't. Even arrested Charles was the same as he was in the rematch with Marciano. Why did he keep fighting? Because he couldn't do anything else, and the money still paid good. For the 5th year, he earned about $50,000. It's certainly not $225,000 for 2 fights with Marciano, but it's still a lot of money. Ezzard had 3 children and wanted his family to not need anything. In early 1956, Charles left the top 10 super heavyweight division, starting in 1942 when he won his first serious fights. Then for 14 years, he was in the top 10 of the strongest boxers. First it was middleweight, then light heavyweight, then super heavyweight. In 1956, Charles had 6 fights, 2 wins, 6 losses. The whole family was against continuing his career. But Charles always saw the world his way. Just like when he first came to the boxing gym and was rejected, at that moment, only he saw himself as a champion. But still, the women's collective took over. Mother, grandmother, and wife talked Ezzard into going. when I told Gladys I'd have a fight in December. She reacted as if I'd poked her with a red-hot poker. Rocky Marciano vacated the title and left boxing. The vacant title was challenged by Floyd Patterson and Archie Moore. Ezzard hoped that Moore would win, because then he would have a chance. The fight took place on November 30th, 1956. Patterson won. The next day, Charles notified the team that he was ending his career. Ezzard opened a restaurant, several bars. He bought more real estate, now in Las Vegas. He was offered a job working with troubled teens for $260 a month. That's good money for a job that's not that difficult. Interacting with troubled teens and teaching them the basics of boxing, 3 times a week. But Charles was only 36 years old, a young guy who still had a lot of energy. He'd been fighting all his adult life, and now that he'd had a quiet life, he felt kind of uncomfortable. Even as a champion, he'd lived a modest life. Though he still fulfilled his childhood dream and bought himself several dozen suits, Charles did not spend money on unnecessary things. He did not get ahead of himself and did not try to look like some kind of a naive. He just lived his boxing life. At the end of 1957, Ezzard became fuller. His weight was over 100 kilos. His wife Gladys insisted that Ezzard start running and even let him go to his old boxing gym. She shouldn't have. The gym was good for him. The sounds, the sensations, the smells. He felt at home. All his old acquaintances were there. They called him Sempian and said they were glad to see him. The example of Archie Moore kept him going. The old mongoose was still the champion at 44. Charles was only 36. At the end of August 1958, Ezzard returned to the ring. Over the next 12 months, he fought 6 fights, 2 wins and 4 losses, not against top contenders, but against fighters he had defeated 10 years earlier, even if he had one arm tied behind his back. Ezzard finally realized that he should not wait for the moment when he would be carried out of the ring on a stretcher. In September 1959, he made the final decision that he would not return to the ring. Gladys was glad of that. Still, they had a serious conversation. She insisted that Charles look after the business himself, rather than relying on partners. While Ezzard was thinking of returning to his bar, restaurant, and children's entertainment center closed because of the illiterate business of his friends. The latter pretended they didn't know him. The tenants of his properties didn't pay for a long time, and the people in charge didn't follow up on it. Charles found himself in one of the 2 traps that all boxers fall into. Either they squander all their money themselves, or they entrust it to the wrong people. Charles was the second type of boxer. He invested all his money. He had to sell real estate, spend all his savings, and even sell his car to pay off his debts. But it wasn't enough. The scale of the problem was not the same as Joe Louis or Ray Robinson, who at the time were at war with the IRS, and the battle was not equal. In some ways, Ezzard was lucky he wasn't so popular, because he didn't have a huge number of bloodsuckers around him, like Ray Robinson. But it was still a problem to solve. My whole career I've been saving up for a rainy day, and it's come. But in the end, it wasn't a rainy day, it was a flood. I was a man who trusted people. If someone told me they were my friend, I really thought they were my friend. These people would come to my house, have breakfast at my house, lunch and dinner. They were constantly asking me for money on the street. To walk somewhere I needed $30. When you're a champion, $2,000 to $3,000 doesn't make a big difference. Although it's actually a decent amount of money. I realize that now. It's the same thing with Joe Louis. Seeing the poverty you yourself got out of it is hard to pass by and not help those who don't have much of a chance to get out. They knew how hard these people were feeling. Joe Louis and Ezzard Charles gave away a lot of money on the streets, thousands of dollars. And even though the Charles family situation was on the brink, the adults managed to make it so that their 3 children didn't even know their parents had money problems. They were fed, clothed, wanted to go to a good school, and they always had money for small expenses. This says a lot about Alice and Ezzard as parents. Moreover, Ezzard even sometimes allowed himself to sit at the bar and treat his friends. Although after such parties, he was always waiting for a scandal from Gladys. In 1962, Charles moved to Chicago, and finances under his full control took Gladys. Ezzard was offered to participate in the promotion of wine business Gallo. Parallelno, he tried his hand at wrestling. But after a year, he quit both businesses. In 1964, he got a job as a salesman at a Dodge car dealership. He wasn't a very good salesman, but Ezzard was a good guy. Plus, he was famous. That helped with sales. They even gave him a new Dodge Polara with buttons instead of a transmission lever. Ezzard gradually paid off his debts, and the family moved into a 6-room apartment in an upscale neighborhood just 5 minutes from Lake Michigan. After a while, he quit his salon job and began earning money again by appearing at various events. After a relatively difficult period, things got better. The family was well off again. January 8th, 1966. Charles appeared as a guest of honor at the fight Reuben Carter, which would later make a movie called Hurricane. Promoter of the fight, a longtime friend Ben Bentley, noticed that Ezzard sometimes strangely shuffles his right foot. Gladys became concerned. Initial examinations revealed nothing unusual except high blood pressure. But then, the doctors were able to make a diagnosis: amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a very rare disease of the central nervous system that can't be cured and that people live with for 3 to 5 years. In very rare cases, up to 10 years or more. It all starts with weakness in the muscles, followed by difficulty speaking. Eventually, muscle atrophy develops. The person is bedridden. There is one important aspect of this disease, and it is like two sides of a coin. On the one hand, brain function is not affected by the disease, so the person continues to think well. But the worst part is that he's completely aware and doomed to watch his body fail. As a supportive measure, Chicago gave Ezzard a well-paid job. He had to talk to troubled kids and steer them toward sports. It helped take your mind off the fact that your journey was about to end. I spend time with the kids. I spend time with all of them, but I usually look out for the most difficult child. I talk to him and hope I can set him on the right path. After a while, Ezzard started walking with him, and soon he was in a wheelchair. But even that didn't stop him from seeing the kids. He knew he had a job to do, and he was going to do it for as long as he could. Rocky Marciano was the first to come to the aid of his former rival. He donated $10,000 to Charles's family. I just wanted to do something good for a man whom I respect very much. We boxers don't have an organization we can turn to when the medical bills get too big, so we have to help each other out. In late 1968, friends of the former champion organized an event called Ezzard Charles Day. Joe Louis, Rocky Marciano, Jersey Joe Walcott, Henry Armstrong, and Muhammad Ali, who at the time was suspended from boxing and lived in Chicago next door to Charles, came. Ali, by the way, was a very big fan of Ezzard and very much wanted to be friends with him. But since Ali at that time was an extremely politicized figure, Ezzard tried not to get close to him because he didn't want to get into a political mess. But Charles treated his famous neighbor with respect. Everyone said words of support and admiration. The last to do so was Marciano, and he brought people to tears with his word. I was in the front row at the fight where Ezzard beat Joe Louis. It was a very good fight, but when I left the arena, all the people around me were talking about Louis. The next day in the papers, it was the same thing. Everyone was crying, and nobody gave Ezzard any credit. People just didn't want to see Louis lose. It's not Ezzard's fault he's being overlooked. He fell into a time period where the bloodthirsty crowd was simply unable to appreciate him. Then, Rocky turned to Charles and said, "I've never met anyone like you. You fought me better than any of my other opponents. You have more spirit and courage than any other man I know." Then, Joe Louis and Jersey Joe Walcott helped Charles up from his chair and stand behind the podium. He was starting to have trouble speaking, but he could still talk clearly. Ezzard said it was the best thing that ever happened to him. He thanked his colleagues and the 1,200 fans who had bought tickets for the event. The crowd and the champions gave him a standing ovation. Ezzard continued to work with troubled children until 1972. In 1974, he was no longer talking and could not even eat on his own. In order to communicate, his wife and children called letters in the alphabet. Ezzard would nod at the right one. In this way, he made up words and could communicate with his family. Gladys had long been advised to put her husband in a clinic where he could be cared for. It was hard for her to accept. The children were against it too. They were prepared to devote as much time as they needed to their father. But Gladys said, "Your father would want you to have he doesn't want to take away your young years." After Charles was admitted to the hospital, Gladys visited him almost every day. On May 26, 1975, the whole family came to visit Ezzard at the hospital. They took him outside, took him for a walk, and before going home, they promised that they would come again in a few days. But that was the last time the whole family came together. On May 28, 1975, Ezzard died. He was 53 years old. Hopefully in his final hours, he was young and slim again in his mind. Money flowed, and his body could do whatever he wanted. Maybe the public finally forgave him. I wish they had. For a long time, Archie Moore was considered the greatest weight ever. When, over time, historians didn't begin to consider one simple thing: competing alongside Moore at the same weight. Ezzard Charles beat most of the same opponents as Moore, defeated Jaros and Charlie Burley, to whom Archie lost. And on top of that, Charles beat Moore himself. Not when Archie was too young or too old. He beat him 3 times out of 3 in the Mongoose's prime years. When you look at Archie Moore's career and you see his mind-boggling 186 wins and 122 knockouts, and that's the most knockouts in boxing history. And then you realize there's a boxer who beat him 3 times and ended his career streak with a knockout. Mongoose was never able to beat Cobra. After that, the questions of who is the strongest in this pairing fall away by themselves, and it becomes obvious who is not really number 1 in the history of the light heavyweight division. But I'd like to analyze something else. If you think otherwise, I'm not trying to change your mind. I just want to offer you a new perspective on what really is the best boxer in history. Most often, you can find the opinion that the greatest is Sugar Ray Robinson. This is the opinion of the popular historian Burt Shuggart, and also American. I remind you that Robinson has 21 victories over Hall of Fame members. Charles has 20, although you have to admit it's more than that. But we'll take the official results. Ezzard is bigger than Robinson, but let me show you this picture. On the left is Ezzard Charles. On the right is Robin. In the middle is Jake LaMotta, nicknamed Raging Bull, is a middleweight. And here's the picture you saw of Robinson and Charles together. Now, think about this. The man on the left, Ray Robinson, beat lightweights, welterweights, and middleweights. And the man on the right beat middleweights, welterweights, and super heavyweights. And the man on the left is fighting Sugar Ray, and on the right is Charles fighting Maxim. I'll remind you that Robinson's peak was at welterweight and Ezzard's peak was at bantamweight. Looking at this footage, can we say that on the left is a welterweight and on the right is a welterweight? I'll tell you later that by today's standards, it's a difference of 4 weight classes. I think now you know what I'm talking about. Let's take the top 10 boxers according to the American Ring magazine. Ezzard Charles is the only boxer in the top 10 who defeated 2 of his neighbors, Moore and Louis, and defeated them. This is not the faded victory of Mayweather over Pacquiao, in a fight after which there is nothing to remember, as if it was not. Charles also defeated Joey Maxim, who was defeated by the leader of this rating, Robinson, although it was not the best version of Sugar, and in general, he is smaller in size. But a fact is a fact. Of course, Robinson also has his own arguments for why he should be number 1 all time. I'm just giving you a reasonable point of view, which you don't have to accept, but which you have to think about. Here's another thing to think about. Remember a boxer named Roy Jones Jr.? When he jumped and defeated John Lewis to take the WBA title, there were opinions that Roy had made a bid for the title of the best boxer. Lewis is certainly not a punching bag, but the most notable mark in boxing history was when he was knocked out by David Tua. If you try to compile a list of the top 100 super heavyweights in history, it's not a sure thing that Johnny will get there. And yet a win over him is a very strong argument for many in favor of Roy as a contender for the best in history. Now imagine that after the victory over Luis, Roy Jones would not return back to the heavyweight but stayed in the super heavyweight division, and in the next fight met with Lennox Lewis. As originally, Lewis of course passed his peak, but still went down in history as one of the best representatives of super heavyweight. So imagine that Roy would not just meet Lennox, but beat him. If that were to happen, I believe that for most people, Roy Jones would be the greatest in history. A win over Lewis would indeed have been a fantastic result, even considering Lennox was in the final stages of his career. Ezzard Charles did what in the case of Roy Jones remained only a beautiful fantasy. Charles defeated the second best super heavyweight in history after Ali. Yes, Joe Louis passed, but after that, Louis went on a winning streak and absolutely had no problem becoming a mandatory world title challenger, which increased the value of Charles's win. Trying to understand why the Cincinnati Kopka is often bypassed, I came to the conclusion that it is still of great importance to be known beyond boxing. Jack Johnson was involved in race fights. Joe Louis became one of the symbols of victory over Hitler and Nazi Germany. Muhammad Ali was known to many more people after he was involved in protesting the Vietnam War. In the late 60s, Ali was primarily a political and a sports figure of the week. Because of this transcendence, when he returned attention to his fights, increased manifold. In addition to stepping outside of boxing, the availability of video footage is huge. Imagine if the two biggest wins of Ali's career against Foreman and the third fight against Frazier had not been videotaped, and there was only footage of the first fight between Ali and Frazier, where Muhammad lost and was knocked down. And say, one of the best trilogies in the history of boxing, Charles versus Archie Moore, and in good quality, and the Ezzard Charles versus Joe Louis fight would have been involved in a world-class political showdown, as in the case of Louis versus Schmeling II, and several documentaries would have been made on it. I am absolutely certain that the balance as to who is who in the historical hierarchy would have changed significantly. Ezzard Charles' career was exclusively sports-related. He, like Joe Louis, shunned radical organizations fighting for black rights and believed that you should fight for your rights with your brain, not grabbing sticks and stones, only worsening the attitude towards the black population. Ezzard was the very example of how a black guy from a poor neighborhood in Cincinnati made his way in the world. Honored athlete, educated, speaks 3 languages. Do you know any black champions from the States who speak 3 languages? Some of them can't even speak 2 words in their native tongue. Ezzard Charles was He wasn't great, but he was great in life. He didn't go into politics, show business, the movie industry. He was a born boxer, 100% to the bone. His life was not full of scandals like many other boxing legends. He never insulted his opponent. Ezzard never got in trouble, never went to jail. He's never been arrested, unless you count the formal arrest after the Barudi fight. But he was never even handcuffed or sent to a cell. He wasn't an alcoholic, a drug addict, or a domestic abuser. He even managed not to get involved with the mafia at a time when the mafia's influence on boxing was the greatest in the history of the sport. Despite all this, Charles remained unnoticed and unrecognized during his life. He began to be recognized and understood only a decade later, when he himself was no longer alive. But this is his story, which began with the fact that a quiet, modest boy who spoke almost in a whisper came to the threshold of the boxing gym, and on it could not be said that in time he would beat the best representatives of one of the toughest and most dangerous sports for all time of its existence. So it is with his career. At first glance, he seems to be an unremarkable name in the middle of a list of great superweights. Ezzard passed away just as he took his first step into boxing, quietly and modestly. And at that moment, you could not tell from his appearance that he was one of the best boxers who ever stepped into the ring, and maybe even the best at all. But despite everything, he holds a special place in the world of professional boxing, and his motivating, very touching and heartwarming story is worthy to be told in detail. He himself deserves as many people as possible to recognize and appreciate his boxing legacy. His name is Ezzard Charles, and from now on, his name will stay in your heart forever.
In the history of boxing, there's a tale to be told of champions who shone bright, but whose stories grow cold. Not the ones with mere luck, not just title holders in fame, but true diamonds in the ring, forever known by name. Forgotten by coincidence, but never by his might. He stepped into the ring and turned the dark to light. Not just a flash in history, but brilliance rare and pure. A heavyweight destroyer, his legacy will endure. He fought with heart and power in every single round. In the arena of the brave, his spirit did resound. A warrior unmatched, his prowess clear and bright. Ezzard Charles the Cobra, forever in the fight. Ezzard Charles, Cincinnati Cobra, hear his story now. Twice the boxer of the year, he made the world say wow. 20 wins over legends, in the Hall of Fame they stand. A middleweight who faced the giants, a true champion of the land. So let's remember Ezzard, the Cobra's mighty name. A boxer and a champion in the hallways of fame. His legacy in boxing forever will remain. Ezzard Charles the Cobra, a diamond in the game. So let's remember Ezzard, the Cobra's mighty name. A boxer and a champion in the hallways of fame. His legacy in boxing forever will remain. Ezzard Charles the Cobra, a diamond in the game. So let's remember Ezzard, the Cobra's mighty name.